All right, good morning, good evening. Welcome everyone to today's stream, today's Just Chatting stream, where we're going to cover off on a bunch of the articles and news items from the last few days that caught or didn't catch attention as we went. And of course, I've forgotten to change over the feed. All right, everything's having a bit of a quick reset as it does that. Now we're in the right spot. Of course, I'd forget to do that. Check the audio. Audio doesn't matter. Well, it does matter, but we're not playing any audio. All right, we're in. Yeah. You'd think you'd remember after your last stream, the gaming stream, to switch the feed back over to the computer. But no, no, not that smart. All right, first things first. We're going to start with a lesson in territorial waters, in territorial airspace, territorial limits, what it means, uh, territory in terms of uh, national and international agreements, all that sort of stuff. Reason for that is obviously there's been a fair few articles popping up over the weekend, late last week. Estonia's been rattling the rattling the sabers, and where there was a uh, where there'd been airspace incursions by drones in Poland and Romania, alleged to have been Russian. This one is not concerning. In fact, what's the reaction that's coming about is not only is it way out of proportion to the events, it's very disturbing because it's going to set a precedence that will allow other nations to react to the countries that are pushing this at the moment. So it will have an immediate effect on operations through the South China Sea, for example, and basically aims to undo a lot of the procedural work that's been done over the decades to build this, all because some politicians got their nose out of joint or they think they can score easy points uh, by jumping up and down on something that is a non-event. If anything, it's the press going nuts. But first of all, okay, so we're going to do a look at some GIS stuff. I would normally use other software for this, dedicated software. I'd have baseline data and would then develop the territorial limits using the international law off that baseline data myself so that I could verify the information is correct or the information that's then presented as correct, and that way I'd know what bits of land, how the baseline was developed, all that sort of stuff. Okay, so we're going to use a Finnish website for this, and it's actually quite a good. It seems to match with a couple of other sources I've seen. The important one for this is that it is um, interactive because I can apply some GIS layers so that we can look at various information and how it may pertain to the recent set of incidents. And of course, I know I should have taken screenshots the other day before we started. Uh, Otherwise, we're going to be staring at a blank screen. But first of all, territorial limits. Okay, so over land, you've got agreed upon boundaries between nations. Um, Now, I don't want to download data set. I want to look at it in the map viewer. Thank you very much. Right. Um, I mean, and that's the thing. There's data sets all over the place. There's nations will have various. declarations for what is considered a baseline, maritime baseline for them. But look, we'll start with overland. So in general, borders are agreed upon between adjacent nations. Obviously, there's border conflicts and bits and pieces, people going back and forth about whether or not the border should be exactly where it is, border conflicts, etc. But by and large, borders form the boundary of nations on land. Airspace above it, and even waters, if it's a wet boundary, it will all be agreed upon. So airspace will basically go from the terrestrial border up to the edge of space. And space itself is considered not anybody's specific territory. So there will be overflights in space by various nations and everything else. So be it. This is taking forever today. Why are you taking forever? Anyway, we'll keep talking while it's going up. When it comes to sea-based borders, there's a thing called it gets a bit harder because, well, um, nations can say, look, no, this has always been our waters, we've always fished them, we've always exploited them, etc. That actually does play a role in determining um, who owns what. I'm guessing there's probably a lot of people have started hitting this service for information that wasn't happening the other day. Here we go. Yeah, I suspect it was a bad request. I should have taken screenshots. Oh, no, here we go. It's loading in. Fantastic. Okay, so here we are. The Baltic is this area. I mean, there's up into there as well, I guess. But what we're interested in is this space here. The overlay is not yet, or the layer is not quite there yet. What we're interested in is specifically this region here. And we're waiting for the layers to appear. What we're going to do is we're going to add coastline, territorial waters, and that's it. Okay. This is obviously taking its time to load in. It's having some issues. Okay, yep, it's doing all the draw files and everything else. This was actually much faster the other day. I don't know what's causing the grief today. But what we're going to look at is who owns what in the immediate area and why and everything else. And this will eventually, hopefully, load in what you've got, particularly when you've got little bits of land sticking out and islands and everything else. In general, there's a 12-mile limit, which inside of which is considered the territory of a nation. Now, there is a baseline, which is either a straight line drawn across bays, connecting islands, this sort of stuff. Inside the baseline is considered internal waters and is usually then managed at a slightly different level. But in terms of what's international and what belongs to a nation, the 12-mile limit is the number that you're concerned about in terms of where the boundary between what a nation owns or has ultimate authority over and everybody else. Now, the next part is, I'll fold that back and we'll just zoom in, see if we can get the lines to draw. This is going to make a liar out of me. I might have to bring up a static image, but so a baseline, for example, you've got the coast here of Estonia. So this bit here, you could potentially, there are rules about what counts as a bay and what doesn't. The limit of distance between 2 points of land versus the depth of so the amount of distance to the back of the bay and width of the bay, etc. That wouldn't be counted as a bay because the points between the external heads are too great. Wouldn't be a bay anyway because there's lots of islands in between. This might be a bit closer because the ratio of that to that is much closer. So that may actually be a straight line and so on and so forth. But because these islands are considered part of Estonia, you might end up seeing, and again, it comes down to various things. So along through here, the baseline would be developed off these islands and their presence. And as a result, so would the territorial limit. Now, who else is this taking ages? So then drawn out from the baseline is a series of 12-mile arcs, and then the arcs are connected as straight as possible. Where the 12-mile lines overlap between nations, generally you'll take a straight line along the midpoint. G'day Ash, how are you? So again, waiting for these lines to fill. In fact, what I might do while we're waiting for that is I will bring up the Baltic Sea territorial lines. Okay. Well, I mean, like I said, it was fine and beaut the other day. It was perfect. That's not the lines we're looking for. That map is a little bit too small for useful information. Because that's actually based off another chart. And the thing with developing baselines and territorial seas, etc., is you want to be as accurate as possible. So you don't want to be taking third hand, fourth hand information and then taking that as being it. Hence, waiting for this to load in. I'm going to have to reload it. I'm serious. This is taking. I'm guessing there's a lot of people looking at it after the last. After the news of the last couple of days, and that's causing issues. Anyway, we'll bring up one of these other charts, and yep, this one should be okay. Nope, that's pipelines. Okay, it's a decent size. Open image in new tab. Okay, so what we have here is a little bit poorer than our overlays. Why won't you load? Okay, so we've got Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. We've got Kaliningrad, which is the Russian exclave next to Poland and Lithuania, and up to the eastern part of the Baltic. So you got Finland to the north, and you've got Russia to the east. Where the articles have been talking about, so we're looking at these blue lines, which are the territorial sea boundaries. So you can see they're all a series of straight lines, in part because the idea of this chart is more to show the pipelines than it is to show anything else. These red lines are the EEZ, and what the EEZ is up to 200 nautical miles, depending on ability to reach 200 nautical miles from sovereign territory, but up to 200 nautical miles, within which a nation has the right to exploit the assets of the sea. So fisheries, mineral rights, uh, basically exert rights over that part of the ocean. Outside of 200 nautical miles, and there's relatively few places, well, mainly in the bigger oceans, there's a lot more. Outside of 200 nautical miles, it's basically free for all. Very much the high seas. So you can't stop people fishing outside of 200 nautical miles. Outside your EEZ, they can sit there all day long fishing as much as they want or doing seabed mining or whatever because that's considered completely international waters. In terms of things that happen while afloat or being able to do things afloat, we're looking at the 12-mile line. Within the 12-mile line, you can exert all rights and laws of your nation. And so you'll have basically crimes and all that stuff. You can exert that. Between 12 and 200, basically, it's management fisheries. People need a license or permission to fish there. doesn't preclude the movement of shipping. So militaries can sail around inside the 200 nautical mile limit as long as they want, and nothing can be done about it in theory, because there's a lot of things that rely upon this. Where you have very constricted water spaces between two nations, so airspace follows the same rule. So where you've got these maritime boundaries, you will have the airspace extending from that magical line up into space is also considered national territory. So for here, Estonia, as far as international rules and regulations and stuff are concerned, is everything inside this blue line plus the physical land elements. And presumably there's a delineation down the waterway here as well. But that is the nation of Estonia. Over here, Latvia is the land borders plus out to this blue line, which isn't necessarily 12 miles. It's like the midpoint between those bits of territory down to here, straight line connection, and so on and so forth. So when we talk about airspace, so before we go to the incursions, where you have different nations and a narrow strip of water between, it'll generally be run straight down the middle. There may be historic agreements as to where that line may sit if it's further one-sided than the other. East Timor and Australia, for example, because East Timor only recently gained full independence, the maritime boundaries and therefore the exploitation of the rather valuable oil and gas resources underneath the seabed needed to be negotiated, because all of a sudden you had a new nation that then had the ability to exert its own, or that exerted its own territorial limits, whereas before it wasn't. And so you've got this sort of needing to negotiate in those sort of circumstances. You then also have things like archipelagic transits and sea lanes and things like that. So whilst you've got Germany and Denmark here with the nice line down the middle, I would argue that there are sea lanes running between the islands here that, whilst they're considered internal waters or they're considered national territorial waters, because of the nature of island chains and narrow sea straits, there still is a need for shipping to transit them and move through. In general, civil shipping just sails on through on sea lanes, not a problem. But it becomes an issue when you're dealing with state assets like Navy ships. And so there are specific rules about what a naval vessel is allowed to do in order to sail through another nation's territorial waters without permission, because it is a standing permission. So in this case, I'm speculating here, it may not be the case. If Germany had naval vessels over here that they wanted to get out to the North Sea and they were going to sail through this archipelago here, there would be dedicated shipping lanes. And if they, the moment they entered um, Danish waters, they have to maintain certain postures. They can't have, they can only have navigation radars activated, for example. They can't have fire control or air search radars or be active sonar. They can't have a lot of sensors turned on because, well, that's military activity. They can't be openly powering up weapons, that sort of thing. It's basically put yourself into a benign state and sail through the waters. And these sort of things have evolved over centuries as you've had navies going at each other and realizing that, okay, you may have beaten the navy at sea, but they've still got to find a way home. And that may mean they have to sail through your waters to do so. Well, you're going to come up with an agreement to make sure they're not going to sneak up and do something whilst they're doing that. Have I got the map? Ever so slowly. All right. Then you've also got straits transits, things like the Malacca Straits between, well, down and around Malaysia, Indonesia, and Singapore. You've got the Straits of Hormuz, and there are also then special rules for transiting uh, the Panama and Suez canals. But a straits transit is like that would be considered a strait, is a narrow patch of water between two or more nations, or maybe even internal, if it's necessarily like that. But again, like an archipelagic transit, a straits transit has very strict limitations on what you can and can't do in order to do it. And there are published sea lanes and track keeping tolerances and stuff. So if you want to sail your navy through the Straits of Hormuz, for example, there are clearly identified entry and exit points, lanes, track keeping, so you can only have your navy within X number of miles of of the middle of the track, and you are not permitted to change direction. You're not permitted to deviate or anything like that, other than for system failures. And basically, if you have to change direction or a variety of things, then either you wait till you exit. Basically, you're not supposed to stop in the middle of a straits transit because that tends to get people upset. Likewise, if you're then taking state aircraft, so military aircraft, along that thing, either you go and get your diplomatic clearances to overfly those other nations, or if you don't want to do that, you can follow the maritime rules and conduct a transit like that. So, military aircraft, mainly maritime patrol aircraft, entering and exiting the Persian Gulf, for example, can conduct Straits of Hormuz transits, even if they don't have overflight from the UAE and Oman or Iran. They can still enter and exit the Persian Gulf. Similar thing through the Malacca Straits. If you don't have diplomatic clearance from the nations around it, you can come in and fly a Malacca Straits transit and be done with it. Now, if you don't exercise this right of free passage, as it's called, other nations or the nations that control the waters or the super adjacent waters will attempt to close them. And there is scope within international law for that to be the case. That if that if free passage is not exercised enough, then those rights may be rescinded, and the waters then closed off. This is one of the reasons why the South China Sea is such a hot topic and an issue, because you've got a number of sea lanes and transits that may be considered archipelagic or straits transits, for example. That's why the US Navy will routinely sail a battle group through the Taiwan Strait, because they're continuing to force open the straits transit between Taiwan and mainland China. And so it's one reason why the navies around the world, and you see the sort of newspaper argument articles whining and carrying on about how it's a provocation and everything else. No, it is. I mean, they may be doing provocative activity while they're doing a straight transit, in which case, yep, they're breaching the protocols of international law to do so. But by and large, it's just basically a physical presence exercising right of free passage in order to keep that free passage. The build up, I mean, since we're talking about the South China Sea, the build up of um, Chinese and Philippine, Vietnamese to a lesser extent, but the Chinese and the Philippines have definitely got places in there that have permanent physical presence. Now, we talked about baselines and 12-mile limits and stuff. Your baselines and how they're constructed, there are a lot of rules about what you can consider to be territory and what you can consider to be land that you draw from. In general, it is water that is above the permanent high water mark. So if you've got a beach that continues, or an island that continues to exist above high tide, you can count that as land. If, on the other hand, you have a island that disappears under high tide, so a shoal, then it is not considered land, and you can't use it to draw your 12-mile line or your baseline. which then impacts your 12-mile line, which then impacts your EEZ line, which then impacts what resources you can and can't exploit um, to your heart's content. And so what China has done is they've been building up a number of these shoals to suddenly have above the high water line land and facilities and stuff like that. And a big part of it too is if you can defend it, well, possession is 9/10 of the law. The the build up and of these islands and stuff like that basically then is an attempt to change it. Now, generally, man-made structures do not count, and so the whole point of this is just give me a blank screen for a sec, and I will see whether the thing is caught up. Come on, don't be slow. All right, we're back. Let me see whether the mapping data is caught up. I'd say no. No. Right, so man-made structures generally don't count as being land above the high water mark. So oil rigs, things like that, fishing platforms generally don't count. Building them on top of a reef also shouldn't count and generally doesn't. But the thing with most international laws is if you have the bigger military and are willing to defend it, well, it's first mover's advantage basically. And so um, China has obviously been upsetting a lot of other people in the South China Sea whilst doing this. The Philippines are manning a wreck on one of the reefs as well. And so they say that that's a permanent thing, and the Chinese will often send Coast Guard vessels to try and dislodge them and everything else. There's plenty of places around the world, plenty of nations that are actually in dispute over islands because that impacts the ability to economically and exploit the oceans around them. So Japan and South Korea, Japan and China, Korea's and China, South and North Korea. Um, there is also a thing about just because the land is above the high water mark, there is sometimes a concern about the ability to have permanent residence. So if you can't sustain life, there are some, or you don't have the ability to permanently um, put people on the island, then the applicability of your claim to that island, other people will contest it severely. So there are a couple of places around the world where that actually goes on. There is an island between Greenland and Canada that Denmark and Canada continually um, fight over. They will have landings from time to time by one military or the other. They'll put their own flag up. Generally, they'll leave a present for the other navy, but in essence, it's a contested piece of land. It's a permanently above the high water mark. It's a genuine island, but there is no permanent habitation, and therefore the ability to claim and enforce your claim on that island is weak. You have places around the world like that. So again, there's the one between Canada and uh, Denmark. There is an island out in the Atlantic. I think it's called Rocknell, which is a point of contention between Ireland and the UK. And uh, basically, it's a sea stack sticking out of the water, but it's far enough out of the water that depending on which nation gets to claim it, will determine how a big chunk of water space and therefore ability to exploit the seas from that point. And there's been various attempts to have to put small detachments of people on there, generally military. The island has no soil, so it can't sustain agriculture, and So you have to be constantly resupplied. And then that raised the arguments about, well, is it worthwhile having habitation? So it's not as simple as saying it's an island, draw your 12 miles, away you go. Uh, or here's the agreed upon baseline, draw your 12 miles, away you go. Because there is continued issues. Okay, so now that we know what territorial seas are and how they're developed, we come back to the issues in the Baltic that have come up and cropped up. Where we're concerned is Estonia, because they're the ones carrying on like the world has ended. Why it's an issue is you have the Russians to the east of the Baltic Sea, and then you also have a Russian exclave down near Poland and Lithuania. Now, the Russians have to get military assets back and forth between the two. Now, there's going to be obviously, they're going to be carrying out all sorts of things whilst doing so, but either you need permission from Latvia and Lithuania. I mean, Belarus would probably give Russians permission to come in and overfly, but in that case, they'd need Polish or Lithuanian permission to then enter their territory to make it to Kaliningrad. I don't think either of those are very inclined to allow that. So, if that's the case, you're then going to find another way to get from Russia to other Russia. And this is where this Baltic Sea problem becomes an issue. In the articles, I'm going to look at them fairly soon, they talk about Russian military assets causing, and in fact, there is an issue with this because the territorial line that they're showing here is actually in the wrong spot. Here's a problem with relying on poor information. If I come back here, if this ever finally loads, the line is further out, and come on, zoom in. So it shows a fairly flat line, but there's islands here that push the 12-mile line up like this when it loads. And since we're looking at it here, there is a small island which is impossible to see at this scale, right here, which is Estonian. Then you've got this big island here, which is Russian. And there's a couple of other islands down here which are Russian. So when you're looking at your limits, this basically becomes internal waters. Not quite internal, but they're Russian territorial waters because there's the land border there and there. But Russia held this land mainly since the end of World War II. And so it has a big dip out into the Gulf of Finland. Estonia has an island there with no permanent habitation. Now, it's got Estonia's biggest rock on it, but with no permanent habitation, there is a potential that other people could lay claim to it. But it's apparently been Estonian territory for ages, and it seems to be fairly accepted. It does not appear Russia is in dispute over the ownership of that island. Therefore, most people will accept the kick out that happens there for the territorial waters because of that island. Okay, not a problem. So this limit in here, this line in here seems to be fairly well accepted with this little kick up in here because of that island. Then the territorial line runs down around here, around like that. The finish line comes out. Now, I was surprised that all these small islands and stuff, and this is where it requires effort and consideration, and you've got to go look very carefully at what the baseline data is. You're looking at all these islands off, well, basically little islands causing the coast of Finland. Now, if you're going to consider it, what is the Finnish coast? Is it this stuff here where it's connected to the main Finnish territory? Or would you consider the coastline to be the edge of all these little islands? How you work that out makes a big difference. So, for example, along here, I'd consider that to be the baseline along here. I wouldn't draw it in like that. That's close enough. I'd be like, yeah, most people would agree with that. Come around there, small islands there, draw your lines, and then do your 12-mile lines from that. But the question becomes, who owns what? There it is. There's that tiny little island. A tiny little island. No, that's actually Russian, that one. The Finnish one is, here we go. Look at the lines. Beautiful. Not beautiful. Ah, come on. Don't be silly. Anyway, when it appears. And the reason it kicks out is there's an island out here. A very, very, very small island, but an island nonetheless that is agreed upon to be Estonian territory. Cool. So the line starts there, and then it comes down here. And basically, where's my scale? No scale? I should have used my QGIS software. Anyway, um, here I am using online services because I think it's going to be easier. Not. Anyway, uh, so yeah, you'd look at this and go, well, that line seems fairly narrow, but there's enough gap for the territorial lines to have a gap between them that then runs up this way. All right, so we're now looking at this patch through here. The territorial lines, territorial limits, territorial seas, territorial airspaces from the seas up are national territory. You cannot go in them without permission. All right. So all of NATO basically has an agreement they can putz around in each other's airspace, but they're basically saying, no, no, the Russians, you need permission to enter, and no, we're not giving you permission. Okay. So the Russians are coming then out of this region because they can, because it's still Russian territory, coming out over in their territorial seas up the top end of the Gulf of Finland, trying to penetrate this point here to then access this narrow strip between the blue lines of international airspace, of basically the high seas. The fact that there's still an EEZ underneath them doesn't matter. In terms of what they're allowed to go and do without permission or without needing overflight rights and things like that, once they get into this channel of airspace here, they're set. And they can enter it from their own territorial waters, fly down, re-enter the territorial waters off Kaliningrad, and that's it. They do not need permission from any other nation in order to do that. Whereas to come in this way, they need Belarusian permission, likely to be given, and then Lithuanian or Polish permission, unlikely to be given. Or Latvian and Lithuanian, yeah, not going to happen. So the Russians have to find a way, and they've got a way to do it. Now, because of the proximity of these lines, it would make sense that there'd be some sort of agreement or some sort of understanding of what the Russians are doing, why they're doing it, and how they're doing it, so that they don't unnecessarily antagonize other nations. Fair enough. Over the weekend, or late last week, the declaration came out, and I will bring it up here. Okay, now we're going to look at the actual news article. So we've got an understanding that what international airspace is, what territorial waters are, what territorial airspace is, and what the situation in the Baltics, particularly the Gulf of Finland, is, which is where this issue is taking place. So we've got all that sorted. And I mean, there's a separate issue where Poland's whinging about overflight of oil and gas platforms. I haven't looked at the location, but I suspect they're probably going to be there. But anyway, all right. So we're now going to go look at. Yep, it's not doing it. Now we're going to go look at the actual news articles. So the first one we're going to look at, because the first one I found with a map, is here from Estonian World. Now I don't know the reputation of Estonian World, whether it's a considered a legitimate um, news source or not, but apparently they've got a slide presented by the Republic of Estonian Defence Forces. Okay, so again, we repeat what we saw there. We've got Russian territorial seas and waters out here. We've got Estonian, Finnish, and then this channel down the middle that is basically international. All right, looking at this, and this is the limit that they've said, this is the track that they've said, that's a nav error. Plain and simple. That's a nav error. And I'm going to walk you through why. I mean, yep, they're jumping up and down that they've penetrated. They were clearly going Russia to Kaliningrad. Okay, the fact they're going A to B, sort of immaterial. They've penetrated airspace. There's no doubt that well, There is still doubt that that's happened, but we'll take this as fact, and I will take this as factual. No reason at the moment to consider otherwise. All right, so um, first things first. We'll consider the aircraft types and everything else. Navigation. All right, so there's many different types of navigation system, and when you're doing those straits transits or archipelagic transits and things like that, there are requirements, or basically you're told to have fix your nav systems before entering, make sure they're as accurate as possible, and there are certain track keeping tolerances. If you can't match them, you can't go down the path, down the path. I would expect coming through here that there'd be some sort of policy about track keeping and navigation tolerance and things like that. So what sort of nav systems are there? How do you fix your position? Well, GPS is one. It tells you where you are in space based, based on a timing solution. But you now need to remember, we've had articles from the last couple of weeks complaining about GPS outages or GPS disruption and drawing off and all sorts of weird things that no one can prove uh, in around Poland, Romania, Eastern Europe, all this sort of stuff, and up in the Baltics. There was a couple of lines in one of the BBC articles talking about Finnair pilots turning around because they lost data while flying south over the water. Okay, I mean, you can see, seriously, at that distance, you'd be able to see it. At altitude, you can see where you're going. All right, next issue. Okay, so GPS. Would Russian military hardware have GPS receivers? Well, not built in. I'm pretty sure they're not being sold GPS equipment. They may have a commercial off-the-shelf handheld kit, but it wouldn't be integrated into their nav system. All right, the Russians do have a GPS equivalent called GLONASS, and it is, I mean, I did have to go and check this the other day because I wasn't 100% sure, but they do have a full constellation. They are fully serviceable. I mean, the occasional satellite drops out, but by and large, it's considered a serviceable system. Because Russia has land up into the Arctic Circle and everything else, and GPS doesn't have great polar coverage. GLONASS is actually the better system for polar coverage because of the orbits that the Russians have put their satellites into. So they are GLONASS is a far better system if you can trying to do track keeping in the polar and Antarctic regions. Sorry, in the polar regions. Polar is both north and south. So given the location here, I'd almost argue that GLONASS would be the better GNSS, Global Navigation System, than GPS. In fact, if you have a modern smartphone, you probably have a blended receiver inside your phone. So when your phone says here's your GPS position, if you're in the middle of a city, around tall buildings, up in the polar regions or down in the polar regions, or in various other setups, sometimes a pure GPS signal is impossible to get or effectively useless. Your phone still keeps telling you where you are based on space signal because it's actually a blended receiver. It will actually receive ephemeris and signals from the Russian GLONASS constellation and will position source of that. Then Galileo, I did check that. That's the EU solution. It's I don't know how viable it is at the moment. Baidu, Baidu, I think is the name. There's a Chinese system like Beidou or something like that. Not sure how full their constellation is. There is a Japanese specific system. I forget the name for it, but if you've ever bought a Japanese import car that supposedly got GPS or position keeping, like a JDM car, particularly from the early thousands, and it doesn't give GPS or doesn't give positional data, It may be because it's trying to connect to the Japanese position keeping system. That and they don't generally provide terrestrial nav data outside of Japan if it's only a JDM model. And the Indians also have a system as well, but I don't know how developed their system is. So there are combined GLONASS GPS receivers, including ones built and sold in Russia. So we can consider that the flight of 3 MiG-31s, which the aircraft type is, quite possibly has a GPS GLONASS receiver or a GLONASS receiver in it, and therefore may be able to do space-based position keeping. What we don't know is whether GLONASS is suffering the same sort of disruption that GPS is. It would be reasonable to assume that whoever's causing, well, that if everyone sort of says it's the Russians doing the GPS outages, it's reasonable to assume that given the region, someone's attempting to do GLONASS outages. So the position keeping of a GLONASS GPS receiver may be in doubt. Generally, you'd be saying it's like one of the better sources, but there is increasing doubt about position keeping. All right, that's the first position keeping type. The second one is fixing from radio nav aids. Now, radio nav aids fixing requires, well, depending on the type of nav aid and the range from the nav aid, you generally want a cut between two or more nav aids in order, and then maybe a third to resolve the ambiguity in the fixing solution. Given the track down here, down the middle of the Baltics, the geometry of nav aid solutions isn't very, very good at all. There'd be nav aids here at Tallinn. There might be a couple more at other base at other airfields, and there's be one or two up here in Finland. But in order to have a super accurate position from radio nav aids alone, you want triangular um, arrangements. What you've got here is basically nav aids on the beam. You're not going to get a very good solution. You're going to have quite large induced errors, and so it's going to be a rather poor solution. Okay, you then have an inertial nav unit. Now, IMSs, INUs, INSs basically are nav systems that are independent of the Earth's surface based on based on gyroscopes and accelerations. It may have physical gyros spinning, or you may have laser ring gyros where you rely on the bending of light um, as a measure of acceleration. And what you do is you tell it where you start based on a very, very well surveyed position. It spins up and then basically does a series of maths as it goes along based on the deflection of the accelerations understood, that if there's an acceleration, that implies that the vehicle, vessel, aircraft is changing direction or changing speed, and that if there's no deflections, then it's maintaining steady speed and heading. Well, it'll still change with gyroscopic precession and everything else. Inertials by themselves are only as good as how well you set them up. And that has a thing called the Schuler cycle. Now, that has to basically do with gyroscopic precession. Basically, what you will see is it's a sinusoidal type curve, about, I think it's 87 minutes, and it is you'll see it in a static inertial, it'll start wandering. It'll go back and forth, and then over time, depending on the quality of the inertial, it'll diverge. Your position will be 10 plus miles out after X number of hours if you're not continually fixing it. And when you fix an inertial, in other words, when you drag the position that the inertial thinks it is back to the real world solution, where you are on that Schuler cycle will depend on the subsequent quality of the position. Now, I'm giving like months and years worth of inertial of navigation training in minutes here, so some things are being expedited. If you fix at the peaks of those of the Schuler cycle and therefore at the maximum error, and then try and reset the curve. Then when the curve steps out again, you've just induced a much greater error and it's going to run away much faster. In the ideal solution, you want to hit the fix as it's crossing the correct position or as close as possible, and so it draws the error bars back in. It draws any offsets. It resets, like it pulls the curve back in again in an ideal solution. Now, if you don't get that right and you induce errors, well, yeah, you can be tens of miles off, like tens of miles. Now, inertial, even solid state ones were you'd be looking at a couple of miles an hour because that's just purely how an inertial nav system works. MiG 31 isn't going to be up for hours. Got to remember, this is only 12 miles. So if you've got your nav error, this nav error only looks to be on the order, this penetration limit only looks to be on the order of 2 or 3 miles, which is, well, you shouldn't be running straight down the border if you only got an inertial, because you should understand your nav system is not super accurate. You want to offset to account for the errors embedded in your system so that you don't, even if you do have an error, all you're doing is you're going to be closer to the line, but not over it. All right. So that's an internal nav system, but that's not fixing to the real world. You still need a means to fix it to the real world. GPS, uh, radio nav aids, or the last one is a radar fix, or like a visual on top. So a visual fix on top. So for example, flying on top this island across the top of the tip of a peninsula or something like that, you've got an exact point in space that you're flying over. But the problem is with altitude, you actually induce an error because it's more difficult to determine an exact on top visually because, well, you could be anywhere up to, I mean, potentially a mile or two off because you haven't determined the exact on top. Now, if you're doing the MiG-31, for example, the back seater doesn't have a, well, may have a downward looking camera, but they can't look out the window, look straight down. So something like that, and given the altitudes a MiG-31 generally flies at, a visual fix is going to have quite a big error induced. Okay. The other fixing type is radar fix. And basically that's using the radar in a ground mapping mode or in a ground mode. You paint the terrain that sticks up above the waters. So all of these sort of things, they'll paint something that with interpretation you can understand what it looks like. You'll be able to interpret this island from this island, for example, or these little peninsulas and everything else, and it will make sense. And then you can, the radar will tell you your distance and bearing from that, which you can then fix your nav system because you go, well, I know exactly where that is in space, and I'm X number of miles on this bearing. My position is exactly here. It's because it then relies on range buckets, azimuth buckets, etc. The type of return. It used to be some nav performances you had to fix within 64 miles so that the bit bucket, the resolution bucket was small enough to give you a reliable position. Anything outside that, slant ranges and azimuths weren't being calculated properly, and the cell, so the return cell is too large to be considered an accurate fix. All sorts of wonderful things like that. Okay, so we know that the nav aids along here aren't really great. There's, if you're flying this path down the middle, there's nothing to visually on top. We know that GPS, at least, has been having outages or sorts of issues through the Baltic area. So GLONASS may also have that. So in terms of your various solutions, you want something to tell your inertial where you are so it's as accurate as possible when you zip down here. So you want to make sure you're super accurate. It may be GLONASS, but it quite possibly was a radar fix. Why I looked at that, now this is a problem here because it doesn't show up on this chart. If I had the GIS overlays, I'd have the coastline overlay open. What you'd see is it'd draw a picture around the island in here, which is the island people say it was penetrating the airspace of. And then there's two more down here in a little path. They're tiny little islands. You're talking things that are maybe 6 feet above the waves at the best of times. A big rock on one of them. Very few structures, very few things that will give a dedicated radar return or a clean radar return. Same sort of thing with a lot of the islands over here. Very, very low lying, nothing on them to really generate returns and stuff. There is a near identical layout and not just sequence of islands, but their relation in space or the relation on the between each other in the water is almost the same between there and there. Now, if you're coming out of here, you want the latest possible good fix before going down here. If you're setting up to use this island chain as a fixing solution, radar fix coming up the MiG-31, you're going to fix, say, on the Northern Island. Therefore, you go, I'm exactly here. I can then go due west. My nav system is now fixed. It thinks I'm here. I can now track through there and be all good. For any number of reasons, sea state, weather conditions, altitude, look down, radar performance, they may have misidentified the island chains and fixed off these ones, and therefore said that that is over here, which induced an error in the nav system. And so aircraft's here, it thinks it's here. And so as you're coming forward, you're now, it thinks it's here, it's going up, down here, you're saying, nope, my nav system is working perfectly fine, I am perfect, I have fixed it, I am good. But you've got this offset. So, like I said, it thinks it's here, but it's really here. And so the aircraft is thinking it's running down this blue dotted line, but it's now down here penetrating airspace because you've induced an error in your nav system. And this comes back to what I was saying the other day in those GPS articles about aviators not understanding their nav systems, the errors that can induce and stuff like that. Now, it's entirely possible. It's just human error. There are plenty of examples of military ships and aircraft in the last 20 odd years penetrating territorial limits accidentally, as they say. And I'm like, well, you got navigators on board some of these things. You should know better. But it's not unheard of. And given their end up track and stuff like that, this looks for all money like a nav error. And it's not an intentional thing. Now we look at the, well, before we go any further with that, okay, 1999, Australia lost an F-111 on exercise in Malaysia, 5 powers defence agreement exercise in Malaysia, where it's simulating the profile of an anti-shipping missile. So it did the missile launch calls and then simulated flying the profile so that the ship it was nominally fired against could actually exercise its fire control and um, air search radars, etc., exercise actual radar returns in order to basically demonstrate to the crew how close in it actually happens before you get radar paint, um, how difficult it can be to identify a low-flying contact from a ship at sea inside of 10 miles, basically, and all sorts of things to do with radar horizons, looking like basically to give the ship practice. Now, the whole practice of flying missile profiles, well, dubious. I mean, there's always been arguments against it, that it's been too risky, etc. But in the process of doing this, it's in a well surveyed area. It's in an area where the crew had done map check, like had map prep and things like that, so they knew it was there. They hit and speared into Palau or AUR 1999 Palau or. So it clipped an island, a previous island, which I thought was Palau Perak, but it may be something else. Clipped an island because the nav, whilst doing, they basically had the requirement they had to do radar map nav. So they had to be using the radar in a specific mode to check for obstacles in front of them, like land and things like that. And in his map prep had made put a line over the top of a rock, an island, and they hit that. They had the pull-up warning, and the aircraft was in, don't know if it was in hand flown or TFR mode, but it got the in the accident investigation report, they got the pull-up warning followed by the worst last words of any aircrew. What's that? It clipped the top of the island, damaged the control surfaces, pitched up, and basically lawn darted into the next island, completely destroying the aircraft and sadly both crew members because, well, they hadn't realised what was going on. And in the accident investigation, it was worked out, yep, they'd misidentified things, they'd missed a couple of things. Now, this is nominally a highly trained frontline low-level bomber crew that is supposed to understand all this sort of stuff and all the other bits and pieces. Accidents happen, errors happen, and sadly in that case it cost them their lives. But it was an example of doing radar fixing and radar map following and things like that where it's possible to have critical errors even when you know you're doing it and you're doing it on purpose and you're definitely doing the right thing, you think, until you don't, until you fly at high speed into a rock. Okay, so it happens. All right, it's not, oh no, it's only the Russians that do it. Everybody has examples in their history, in most military histories, where positional keeping has gone by the wayside, and you've either flown into someone else, or you've flown into a great big pointy rock, or really, really bad things have otherwise happened. There is one other position keeping method that's available to aircraft like this, generally interceptors, fighters, GCI. It's a ground control intercept, but in essence, it's a positive radar fix given by a ground system behind them, telling them where they are, or by an AWACS, airborne warning system, that will then give them relative positional accuracy based on their own position. All right. So now we've sort of walked through all of that. We're now going to look at the aircraft itself. So 3 by MiG-31s. Now you could say, well, each of the aircraft should have been doing its own position keeping, etc. The aircraft have like according to the available reporting, they have a data link type system that allows the up to 4 aircraft in formation or in a flight or in a designated um, group to share information. And that includes relative position keeping. So if you've got one aircraft being nominal lead, it or one of the aircraft has responsibility for the physical position keeping, so working out where they are in space and territory and all that sort of stuff. It then the other aircraft then position relatively off that, and away they go. At least all 3 aircraft stick together. They're not running independent. I mean, they may run independent nav solutions, but they're going to be, their main job is stay in formation and rely on the navigational accuracy of the lead aircraft or whichever aircraft has the duty. So in this case, yep, okay, all 3 aircraft flying together in formation. Cool. You don't want them wandering all over this channel. You want them, okay, you want one to have good accuracy and stay together, get through. Fair enough. All right. Then the MiG-31. Okay, largely designed as a high supersonic, high-speed interceptor for taking out B-52s, U-2s, and maybe the SR-71 if it could try. Kind of like, well, the US didn't really have a system. The F-15 to some extent, but not really. There were older Cold War era aircraft the US kind of had that sort of did it. But the main role of the MiG-31 is super high speed interceptor, Mach 2.3 plus, etc. Now you're not going to go flying on a general transit at high Mach levels or above the speed of sound because, well, you're going to leave sonic booms in your way. You're going to upset shipping. It's unnecessarily antagonistic. So we're going to assume that they're going to do a mid-level transit at high subsonic speed. So fast enough, like an aircraft that's designed to operate at super high speeds generally gets less controllable at lower speeds because, well, the aircraft is designed to spend most of its life going fast. So we'll look at a high subsonic speed, about 540 knots, 9 miles a minute. It says it was in the airspace for 12 minutes. So you're looking at about 100 and, well, 9 miles a minute, 10 minutes, 90 miles. Add on another 18. You're looking at 108 miles of airspace penetration. That, on the map, is not quite 108 miles, but close enough. Now, you think, well, that's quite a long way, but at 9 minutes, your work cycle, your duty cycle in the cockpit may be that you may not be looking back down at the nav solution. You might be looking at other things. Should that be the case? I mean, obviously, if you're trying to navigate something like this, you'd want to be focused quite a bit on track keeping and position keeping. But it says they can carry Kinzels, which are the long-range cruise missiles, but by and large, they carry anti-air missiles. They can carry one Kinzel, and they can carry a anti-radiation missile, like a Shrike, a Russian equivalent of a Shrike type thing. That's not necessarily I mean, I also would suggest they weren't going to be carrying weapons on a transit like this, because again, that comes down to the ability and rights and regulations of transiting territorial limits and things like that, about open display of weapons, what you can and can't have and show, and all the other bits and pieces. Now, if they were fully armed, 3 Kinzels and 3 Shrikes, or 3 anti-radiation missiles harms, aren't going to do much, to be honest. Really. Did they file a flight plan? No. Did they have a transponders turned on, or ADS-B? No. Were they talking to anyone? No. Did they have a flight permit? No. In other words, overflight permission. Now, irrelevant, 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 irrelevant. Out here, I'll say in territorial limits, they can do what they want. Out here, they can also do what they want. So the fact that there's no flight plan filed, have a whinge. The fact they've got their ADS-Bs turned off, well, their state aircraft, have a whinge. If they're not talking to Estonia or Finland, have a whinge. And they had no overflight permission. Okay, you weren't going to give it anyway, so why whinge about it? So it's an error that it looks all money like a track keeping error. The problem is it's now blown up bigger than Ben-Hur. Okay, so yep, they're whinging and carrying on about this, and they flew F-35s out to intercept and go away. There's this island, Vane Blue Island, which, like I said, is this tiny little thing all the way up here. It's minuscule, but it's enough for them to have their territorial limits. They've said in the vicinity of it. No, based on this slide, that's the island over here. I would have said Abim Tallinn, like near Tallinn. But hey, whatever. I didn't make up this propaganda. Um, Everyone's crying and carrying on, and it's world. It's no accident. It's a deliberate provocation designed to test NATO's reasonableness. It's bloods. Wait a second. It's the 4th violation this year. Okay, it sounds like there's a series of errors. They have occasional errors. It's tiny. It's Moscow's willingness to probe its borders. There's plenty of history out there and examples out there of what a border probe actually looks like. This is not it. Not it at all. This is a nav error. It's a positional track keeping error. And even if it wasn't, there's nothing to be gained there's nothing that they could have overflown. They're not carrying sensors that are going to improve any knowledge about what's there. That's the wrong platform to do it with. And you're going to be hearing squawking from controllers the whole way along anyway. There's nothing in here. There's nothing to be gained. It doesn't give the Russians and a picture of something they didn't already know. Right, so we then look a little bit closer at what goes on, because some of these things start looking interesting down here. We're staying with Estonian world. We now move back. NATO intercepts hundreds of Russian military jets. 2020. Huh. Okay. To intercept a Russian IL-76 that was flying close to Estonian airspace. Okay. We just looked at an article that showed the picture. Again, that blue line's in the wrong spot. That it's only on the order of 10 miles across, 5 miles across. If they want to go from Kaliningrad to Russia or back and forth, they have to go down this narrow tube. They're going to be within 10 miles of Estonian airspace. It has to fly close to Estonian airspace. NATO air forces scrambled about 350 times to intercept Russian military aircraft approaching the alliance's airspace, including 48 times by NATO jets at Estonia's Amari. About 350 response to flights by Russian military aircraft. It's an increase. Russian military aircraft often do not transmit a transponder code indicating their position and altitude. So in other words, they're not ADS-B reporting. They do not follow a flight plan or do not communicate with air traffic controllers, posing a potential risk to civilian airliners. They're allowed to do that. We're always vigilant. NATO fighters on duty around the clock, ready to scramble, blah, 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 blah. Air policing is an important way we provide security, yada, 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 yada. Okay, so, all right, so that's from 2020. We then look here, 2019. Funnily enough, that picture looks almost exactly the same. All right, British RAF Typhoon fighter jets from Amari intercepted an IL-76 that was flying close to Estonian airspace. Again, close to. It wasn't penetrating, it was following that path, going back and forth. It was doing QRA duty when the scramble was called. Scrambled to intercept an aircraft that was approaching Estonian airspace from the south. So it was flying from Kaliningrad back up to the main part of Russia. We identified and monitored it as it transited close to NATO airspace, standard protocol for aircraft that might not be communicating with ATC or on a recognised flight plan. Again, they don't have to do it. The Baltic Air Police mission is a NATO air defence mission in order to guard the airspace over Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania. Okay, blah, 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 blah. Routine NATO mission. Launched as well, intercepted another IL-76 that's flying close. Okay, so you can see now that actually, that you've got the Russians following fairly standard procedures that are legally permissible and in appropriate airspace and doing things that they're allowed to do, and they're being harassed by NATO aircraft. Now, this is a much more interesting aircraft. That IL-76 could have had various sensors fitted to it. This one is clearly some form of airborne early warning aircraft, so maybe control of fighters, that sort of thing. Most of the NATO intercepts in 2021 occurred in the Baltic region. The Alliance's jets scrambled 290 times to hit Russian planes, 370 times across Europe in 2021, to check aircraft flying unannounced near Allied airspace. 80% of the missions, 290, in response to flights by Russian military aircraft, and most of the intercepts in the Baltic region. NATO has similar missions for other places, helps police the skies of blah, 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 blah. Generally, intercepts occurred without incident as NATO planes take off to identify the approaching aircraft and escort it out of the area. Very few intercepted flights entered Allied airspace. Okay, nav keeping, track keeping, all that sort of stuff. Fine. Protecting blah, blah, blah. Okay, yep, they don't have their own thing. Okay, so you see here, you've got hundreds of these intercepts, hundreds of these flights happening per year where, okay, this aircraft, I'd be a little bit more concerned about what it's gathering or what it's doing, even in international airspace, but they're following what they're able to do. So this thing over the weekend or the end of last week has now blown out into some sort of stupid thing. All right, unexpectedly brazen. Okay, that is not a MiG 31, and is that actually Polish? Just trying to think. There's only a handful of nations that do the fake cockpit paint. Canada's one. That's not a Canadian aircraft, despite what some people may think. Definitely not a Canadian aircraft. So, incorrect picture of an incorrect aircraft. But unexpectedly brazen. Estonia invokes NATO treaty, so that's Article 4 that they're looking at. And it's like, um, condemned Moscow after 3 Russian fighter planes. All right, so we've seen from this Estonian World articles that it's a fairly standard thing, the flight path to and from Kaliningrad. We've talked about not only the legalities of the airspace and how it's determined and where people are allowed to be with and without permission. We've then also looked at the requirements for navigation and potential causes for navigation error, all that sort of stuff, and it all also makes sense. Oh, sorry, I didn't see your comment there. Yeah, I would expect it to have GLONASS. Um, there, Ash, half an hour ago, sorry. That's what I'm saying. I would expect them to have it, but there's no information that I could find that definitively stated that was part of their avionics suite. And I did see Russian handheld equipment that was blended, and the same with the well, in a way. Okay, so sidebar. The reason for this, in part because it gets under my skin for some things from my own past, but it is given everything else that's going on in the world, particularly in that region. This is an overreaction, and like I said, there's historic evidence of other nations penetrating other nations' airspace all over the place. And the problem is, if we go and we allow this to be blown up into outright conflict or with actual consequential actions, goes back to one of the things from the other day of you've got to be very careful about the rules or the standards you hold other people to, because at some point in the future, you will be held to that standard yourself. And that was talking about genocide declarations and everything else. But this is the same thing here. If you claim the moral high ground and attack somebody or pretend that this is a massive escalation of something when in reality it's fairly benign, the next time a aircraft or ship from your nation enters the water space or airspace of a nation that doesn't like you very much, you're going to lose that moral high ground very quickly and suddenly find yourself with a bunch of dead sailors and airmen because the reaction you've already established as appropriate was then used against you. And the thing is, this is something that happens all the time. It's happening all the time around the world. I mean, going through the Straits of Malacca, going through the Straits of Hormuz, going through the Straits of Taiwan. People are making nav errors. These sort of things happen. And it's one of those things where you've got to understand that these procedures and policies and stuff exist, but take a little bit of a hands-off approach of you sit, watch, and observe. And like I said, 3 MiG-31s cutting the edge of Estonian airspace, not a threat, not an issue, really. It's nav error. Yeah, sure. Tell the Russians you shouldn't have done it, but the problem now is the media, everybody else are running this cycle of escalation to the point that it's gotten to the UN Security Council. Well, that's the thing. I showed those Estonian articles from the last 5 years where they're talking about, oh, this is continually happening, and that's the point though. Is irrespective of whether they're an international pariah or not, Russia's well within their rights to do it. And well, they know that Finland and Estonia and Lithuania and Latvia don't want to talk to them, then, well, we'll just fly in accordance with permitted procedures and do it. And but the problem is it's blowing it way out of proportion. So there was an incident, probably five, well, actually no, 10 plus years ago now, where a Russian carrier group sailed down the English Channel, an action they are completely permitted to do by international law. And they didn't need to coordinate with anyone. They could have just sailed through, just like American battle groups do all the way around the world in various other straits. The amount of crying and screaming in the media about provocations and escalation was incredible. But at least the governments at the time were like, and they didn't do anything. And that's okay, potentially. And see, this is the reason I'm covering it is because I think it's going beyond that. And the more you rattle sabers, you build um, you build a. All right, we'll take an analogy, a separate analogy. We've seen recently what happens when you take political speech and rattle the sabers over it. Eventually, the message is going to get through to someone that violence is okay, and they're going to act on that. And then they're going to sit back and say, "Oh, it wasn't our fault." It's one thing to rattle sabers. It's another thing to be doing this. It's disproportionate responses. And generally, that's the thing with military response. You want it to be as proportionate as possible. You don't want to be escalating things unnecessarily. And this is an unnecessary escalation, particularly when you're looking at the yelling and screaming about GPS outages, which even in the articles announced that it wasn't proven. And the it's it's the actual physical event is almost is almost by the wayside, really. It's the way the media and therefore the various government talking heads and stuff are rattling sabers and beating the drums of war. Anybody who understands military history or looked at major events in history can see when rattling sabers unnecessarily can actually be can have real world consequence, and it causes one of two problems. One, people realize that it's a non-event because nothing's happened, and eventually you have the problem of the boy who cried wolf. So that when something consequential does happen, you've basically made the media listening people bored of everything. They're not going to listen to it because, unlike the other 990 times, nothing came about. But you standing there screaming about war, it's the boy who cried wolf. The other problem is where you have the American Spanish War being influenced by the USS Maine and the reporting and the misreporting initially on that, and therefore the egging on of war that the American press engaged in at the time in order to drive conflict with Spain. Or you could look at the more recently. Okay, let's look at the Middle East. Iraq, for example. The first Gulf War, one of the consequential events that led to the war taking place was the Nasiriyah testimony, which was later proven to be false or completely fraudulent. That was the one that was talking about Iraqi soldiers kicking babies out of humidity cribs and throwing them to the ground, all that sort of stuff, and basically got the moral outrage in the West to the point that the public basically went, go in and get rid of them. But that stuff never happened. It was a series of lies. Now, who fed that to the person who gave the testimony and how it came about? Well, there's plenty of books and stuff out there, but it was also, I don't think it was made public at the time that the person giving the testimony was the daughter of a Q80 diplomat. And the question is, well, how did she be in a position where, if the reality of that taking place was what happened, that she would have seen and understood all that? Or you look at the 2003 invasion. When General Powell gave his presentation to the UN General Assembly in late 2002 about the aluminium tubes and everything else. Now, not Bush, uh, Saddam had been thumbing his nose at the West, expecting there to be no consequences because, well, as far as he was concerned, he hadn't done anything more than he'd already been doing. But I distinctly remember watching and listening to General Powell's presentation to the General Assembly going, there's no evidence here as such. Like, he's said a lot of things, he's put a lot of things forward, but either the weapons inspectors already said that didn't exist, or it's a non-event, or we can't find what you're saying. But if you listen to the words General Powell was saying, he was establishing the casus belli for the invasion in 2003. That was the point at which, effectively, I mean, the wheels for war had already been turning, but that was the point where it was now effectively official. There was going to be war coming down the pipeline. And it was false. It was exaggerated. General Powell later came on, before his death, came out and said that he was embarrassed by all of it. Now, and he did as he was told by Bush. And that's him copping out. I mean, a four-star general should have the integrity to know what's what. But that was, in essence, the start of the official public move into war. Now, there were anybody who understands logistics would have seen the build-up already happening, would have noticed that the plans for war were already rolling at that point. But the point to take away from that is a propaganda narrative was allowed to be put out into the media, into public awareness, and be used as justification for pushing into war. Okay, so when you come back now and look at these issues with an international pariah, however, yeah, there was normalization there for a while with Russia, but it moved away. The other part of it too is we're only seeing one side of the reporting. Now, it's difficult to get, well, accurate reporting, I guess, out of Russian sources, but we're having to take at face value what people are telling us. And sometimes it goes wrong. The reporting on Ukraine, I tend to avoid that because it's full of outright lies and propaganda from both sides. There was a clear-cut war crime carried out by Ukrainian forces that everybody danced around celebrating. But under the Geneva Conventions, it was a very, very clear-cut war crime. And I think, and I'd sort of alluded to this in other streams, there was a point, I think, where somebody in NATO headquarters went and checked the Geneva Conventions and went, oh, because all of a sudden the statements coming out of NATO stopped. There was zero outward support for what just happened. The governments that, led by politicians, probably didn't understand things, kept jumping up and down and everything else. But the statements coming out of the military people who should have known better suddenly stopped, which gives the indication that somebody had a quiet word, or somebody's had a quiet word about the legality of what was undertaken, and that whilst we're building this case against Putin for prosecution in the ICC because of war crimes and everything else, we have this blatant war crime that is spread across the global media and being celebrated that no one understands or is paying attention to. And so it's this blatant misrepresentation in the media that is being used to drive hate and escalate conflict. I mean, irrespective of his progress on it, I kind of agree with what Trump has to say about it, which is he wants the killing to stop. There is a lot of unnecessary dead littering the battlefields of Eastern Europe because propaganda was allowed to drive outcomes that should never have happened. And so rattling of sabres is one thing. Don't be surprised when someone responds to it. You're egging on a an escalated response. And it it in a way gets under my skin because some of this stuff is tied into things that I know lots of stuff about because of prior history. But it's seeing the way the media is running with it and what people are allowed to do with it that is scary. That scares me. Um, and if no one stands up to say anything of, hey, put the brakes on, sure, get upset at the fact that the airspace penetrations happened, but take it proportionally, be proportionate, understand the likely reasons why it's happened. Look at the platforms involved. Understand they're not there collecting information. MiG-31 won't collect. Understand what's going on. But then also be cognizant of what you've been doing over the last 5 years to escalate and everything else. I don't mind the fact that people go up and do these airborne intercepts outside territorial seas, etc. That's, again, part of how the game is played. But it should not be done pretending that they're the only nation that does it, nor should it be done with the expectation that this is some sort of provocation. It's not a provocation. And in order to understand that, it's not just a case of here's an article. You've got to go back and look at the legal things around it. It's like the deployment of the US Navy off the coast of Venezuela at the moment. Is that a provocation? Well, yeah, it is. And the the wringing of hands that takes place on social media and in articles when those go fasts were being sunk with the narcotics on board. It's not an attack against Venezuela. It's been done in international waters on the high seas. The US appears to be following the international laws on doing things like that, despite what other people are saying in articles and stuff like that, trying to paint it all as some sort of crime against humanity. No, it's. I saw stuff. I'm like, I'm a lawyer. This is bad. This is a war crime. And it's like, well, no, you're an attorney for something unrelated. You don't even know what the United Nations Conventions on the Laws of the Sea are. You don't understand the difference between territorial waters and the high seas. You don't understand why vessels are flagged under various nations and what flags of convenience or national flags are. You don't understand what the concepts of criminality or law enforcement on the high seas are. But it didn't stop them from running their mouth. Didn't stop them from escalating rhetoric to say that what the US was doing in that context was bad. Now, I think most people would say it was probably a good thing, but it wasn't what dominated the media return. And in that case, it was like, well, no, it's just like what Russia's doing here. The US was entitled to be there and do what it did. In fact, the US is one of the nations that will quite happily sail adjacent to territorial waters and do whatever it wants with its battle groups. You can't stop them, as in other nations, because it's legally permitted. Is it being a good neighbour? No, not really, but it happens. We talked about this the other day with the Chinese warships doing live weapon firing in the Tasman Sea between Australia and New Zealand. By international law, they were completely permitted to do what they did where they did and didn't have to tell anyone. They warned civil air traffic to get out of the way, and yes, to be a good international participant, they should have done NOTAMs, should have at least notified the airspace authorities that this was going to go on. They didn't have to, and so they did that. And so uh, it was not just a weapons drill, but it was sending a message to Australia and New Zealand. Okay, it happens. It goes on. And yeah, this whole thing about you see, the concern I think should be more looking at what China and India are doing, watching this go on, because I don't see Russia doing things outside of the European region. China is going to take what happens to Russia and what the West does and everything else as carte blanche authority to carry on doing what they're doing in the Pacific, in the South China Sea, and areas like that, and basically point fingers back and saying, but hey, look, you allowed this, and this is where rattling of sabers and everything else is not a not something we should be building towards. So yeah, it is a bit of a rant, but it's a well-sourced rant, and it comes as a warning. Yeah, I mean, I'm on a soapbox here, but I'm not saying anything that's inaccurate, and I'm not saying anything that shouldn't be out there. People need to be considering this as part of their response. And well, yeah, it's it's the sort of thing that inflames tensions, but doesn't need to be there. It's like gossiping in between groups of kids at school. It causes tension between groups of friends that doesn't need to be there because there's nothing underlying it. There's nothing that's actually causative. But yeah, so I mean, you see here. So this is so going back to these articles. It's like unprecedentedly brazen. No, we've just covered that in the other articles. Um, it's testing the alliance's readiness and resolve. No, we've looked at that. It's covered it, and it's statements like this. There's no other way to take it other than it's, as you say, it's rattling of sabers. Yep, okay, Russia and Belarus ended their exercise, but we look at the map. Belarus is not near it. Well, it's near Estonia, but it's on the other side. Okay, they were forced to withdraw, even from the Estonian military's own slide. No, they were quite clearly navigating east to west and left on their own time. And it's like, okay, why add in this statement then of, oh no, that's fine, no worries, Ash, trust me, you be listening to this for a while. As I said in my session zero stream, I've these are things that get under my skin, and that's why I'm doing it. It's you're really going to see stories about sunshine and rainbows and kittens and unicorns in these streams. It's because otherwise I'm ranting at the wall. And look, I don't mind it. Uh, well, I was going to say, as Charlie Kirk showed, well, unfortunately, he got killed for speech. You need to put these ideas out there. You need to challenge them. I'm not necessarily right. Well, I'm more right than a lot of these articles, but I need to be challenged. I need to be shown that, yep, okay, some of what I'm saying is archaic or shouldn't be said because it's wrong. Great, prove it. Show me. But until then, I'm going to start point out the flaws in what is being pushed. And sadly, especially in Australia, the media down here seems to be really much marching along the the same path. And sometimes it doesn't work so well. I mean, it didn't work for Australia very well with East Timor, that's for sure. And look, I don't mind. Yeah, get beneath the skin. That's what these streams are for, so that these sort of things don't happen through my gameplay streams, like they do sometimes when some of my other viewers distract me. Um, but yeah, but see, comments like during time, to which time the high-speed aircraft could have traversed broad swathes of the country. Okay, yeah, the MiG 31 can go at 13 odd 100 odd knots, which is uh, 20 miles plus a minute over 12 minutes, yeah, it would have flown, done several laps of Estonia. Uh, you, they're just, it's unprecedentedly brazen. These guys, and I think there's another part to it too, and I don't know how true it is. But there's been discussion, there's been stuff I've seen that suggests that a lot of this posturing and chest beating is because they've not had to stump up for their own protection. Oh, no, I don't wonder. I I remember the journo list affair. Now, again, depends on what media you read, whether as to how much they got covered. But during, was it either Trump's first term or during the lead up to the 2016 election, there was a mailing list that a lot of journalists were on, which was then nicknamed Journo list when it got publicised. But it kind of showed them coordinating commentary on things. Now, at the same time, yes, the media often presents a mouthpiece of the person who owns it or the people who own it, and you have various groups like Sinclair and Next, whatever the one cancelling Jimmy Kimmel at the moment is. Yep, if they'll own whole swathes of networks, yep, you're going to hear that. Okay, the thing about uninformed, now obviously I'm going to say this out loud because the comments don't go over the video for recording. The comment in chat is understanding bias in news. Yep, not an issue. What the chatter was afraid of is how uninformed news people are. There's a thing called, oh, yeah, okay, it's called the Gell-Mann amnesia effect. And Michael Crichton, the author who wrote Jurassic Park and a whole bunch of other books, whatever you think of him, was a doctor, uh, came up with this concept called the Gell-Mann amnesia effect. And he talks about it basically, you sit there reading the paper and you look at an article that you know technical details about. You know what the ins and outs are. And you read it and you see how badly they've misinterpreted, misleading, basically outright lying about whatever the article's about because you understand the tech or the actual incident. And you go, well, that's rubbish. They clearly know nothing about that. Then you turn the page and start trusting the paper again on whatever else it's reporting on. The amnesia effect. You look at something you know detail on and know that they don't understand it and quite clearly are very, very wrong. But then you sort of let that go by the wayside when you get to the other side. And yeah, oh, we've got a couple of tech things coming up yet. So yeah, Russia denies wrongdoing, which is, yeah, Trump wasn't briefed, reckless behaviour, blah blah blah. How can one side be a pariah when you keep running things up the flagpole like that? At some point, someone's going to do something. Okay, did I get that wrong? Okay, they got rid of that article. Well, I suppose they got rid of that article because someone told them it was wrong. Good on them. Okay, US silence as Russian jets enter NATO airspace. Again, beating the drums of war. Okay, unprecedentedly brazen move. Yeah, it wasn't, and it's not. But go and ask Joe Public. Yes, it is. So, it's again. Yeah. I mean, look, it. I'll admit, if I didn't have the background in understanding the ins and outs of international airspace and water space and territorial limits, I'd be worried about it too. I'd be like, what's all this mean? Where do those lines come from? What do they mean? It's important to understand it because it has material effect and it's going to make a big difference. So there you go, MiG 31, and it's like, yeah, um, escalate, escalate, escalate. So, but Estonia struts around a bit. I had speaking to someone who works in information security. They basically try to tear shreds off me for, oh, this Estonian person says this. I don't know how long they've been in information security for, because in the 2000s to 2010 in particular, I would say a clear three-quarters of the attacks against my networks that I was looking after at the time, and the sites and everything else, were Estonian and Ukrainian. There were some from Russia, there's the occasional one from China, bits and pieces from elsewhere around the world, but a lot of what it was um, well, organised crime out of former Eastern Europe, so Albania and places like that as well. But the source location and everything else that's coming out of it were Estonian and Ukrainian. Just like everybody forgot uh, about um, everyone forgot about the corruption in Ukraine once they got invaded. But so we're talking about how people don't understand things and it's saber rattling. But okay, one thing to mislead the public, but now, oh no, Australia's joined in and blah, 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 blah. It's like Australia's got, we're the other side of the world. Why does Australia need to lash Russia after a nav error? It's like, okay, yep, useless background, useless background. In a joint statement overnight, the Australian government outrageous violation of the territorial integrity of Estonia and wider pattern of Russian provocations against its name. Okay, not only do we not have a dog in the fight, why does Australia need to have that statement? Why do we have to be involved in this? Well, obviously, someone's been telling politicians or telling people who don't know what they're doing uh, stuff. And as it is, clearly they're not carrying Kinzhal missiles. If that's one of the actual ones, if that's one of them as well, then clearly they weren't carrying anything that was ground attack capable. Russia's reckless actions represent not only a breach of international law, but a destabilizing escalation. You're just opening the doors for China there. Good work, mate. Because not the first time China's weapon drills in the Tasman Sea aren't the first time China's come down and poked its nose into Australian interests. But this collective statement, though, when you look at it, joint press stakeout, I would like to read a statement on behalf of, as well as my own government, Estonia. So it's some Estonian who's reading all this out and has said it and blah, 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 blah. Okay, nav error. Yep, okay. Oh, well, I actually think it took place, but whatever. There is, I mean, and they went and called a meeting of the Security Council. It's one thing to have it as um, just rhetoric in the paper. It's another thing to have it. Oh, now you've got um, Security Council meetings over it. Again, saber rattling. It's being run up the flagpole. So Russian warned airspace violations with direct armed confrontation with NATO. Ah, so uh, when the the thing I'm afraid of is that we're going to see a NATO aircraft or some other Western aircraft that strays too close to Russian airspace or otherwise, yeah, he's going to get shot down. If you understand your history, there's an incident that was the shooting down of KAL 007, Korean Airlines Flight 007. It was on a flight um, through that came from the US heading for Korea, I believe. But basically, it was on a leg coming out of Alaska. They'd made a significant systems error when realigning their inertials because they didn't have GPSs at the time. They ended up overflying the Kamchatka Peninsula and overflying some sensitive Russian sites. And as a result, they were shot down. And uh, that caused, well, quite clearly a massive international incident. But in the fallout from all of that, not only was there policies and procedures for navigation, track keeping, maybe moving air routes, all this sort of stuff, but at a political slash state level, there were concerns and questions and understandings about what should and shouldn't happen, what was acceptable responses, etc. Um, and I mean, uh, it's like, I guess, the USS Vincennes. Yeah, see, that's the thing. So KAL 007. So yes, it is a big thing in Asia that had happened. And sadly, it was a result of nav error. Now, people can speculate that they were intentionally flying a different heading to overfly and gather intel and all that other bits and pieces. Um, uh, it's more than likely it was just a nav error. They screwed up navigating, resetting their nav systems in Alaska, and so took off with an error already, and positional error already in their systems. Now, Russia replied as they thought was appropriate, and likewise caused an international incident. That's what I'm scared of with this sort of stuff, is that there's going to be uh, something or someone will do something that they shouldn't, and there's going to be a smoking hole in the ground before too long. And then the gloves will come off. People are going to get very, very upset. And for no good reason other than somebody's strutting around like a pigeon, wanting to feel big. And so you're going to confront airplanes and drones violating airspace and increasing incursions and entering new. Okay, this statement here: Russian military aircraft also entered neutral airspace over the Baltic Sea on Sunday, prompting NATO planes to be flown out to escort. We've just spent time looking at that pathway that they have to follow if they want to get to Kaliningrad and back. This is provocation by NATO. They're in international airspace. Now, they could be in controlled airspace acting in uncontrolled manner. Possible. Who knows? That pertinent detail is missing. But they're allowed to be there, and they're allowed to be doing what they're doing. And what you've got is NATO causing issues by screaming out into neutral airspace to do this. It's like, I understand tribalism and wanting to feel like your side of the things is doing right. But sometimes you've got to take a step back and just look at, why are we doing that? And is it right? Yeah. And it's like, your reckless actions risk direct armed confrontation. No, no, it's not. Uh, it's Some people need to be slapped back into place. Uh, Not saying Russia needs to slap people. Someone else needs to come along and tell some little countries, settle down, stop upsetting things. It's designed to test NATO's readiness and resolve. No, it wasn't. It's a nav error. Trust me, I can go and find tracks and historic data to show what happens when you do that. In fact, I can show you people tracks of US military assets doing exactly, not, in fact, no, not just that, doing worse in order to provoke air defense reactions from Russia. And then realizing in the after effect that was pretty bloody stupid, because once the reaction is provoked, you don't know what level they're going to react at. So Yeah, Russia labels the meeting theatre of the absurd. Yep. Okay, the Russians are sitting there like, what the hell is going on? What, why is this going to this level? And I would have preferred somebody else other than the Russians to have to say this, but when you decide you want to engage in a serious discussion about European security, about the fate of our common continent, and how to make this continent prosperous and secure for everybody, we'll be ready. Yeah, I wish somebody else had said that. Uh, all right. Okay, that's enough. We're going to get off that high horse, and now we're going to get into one that um, I'll admit I saw in passing. Now, I haven't done much on this one. Haven't. Well, you see, okay. Before we obviously, I just saw the comment in chat about the drone flyovers. Talking of that, and I did talk about that in one of the earlier streams. The facts: airspace was penetrated by a drone of a type operated by Russia. Yes? Yep. Okay, that happened. Where did it come from? Now, balance of probabilities, probably Russian launched. The one in Romania is really weird. I'm surprised that it's considered, given where it got to and everything else. Yeah, that's a bit more sus. Um, I think based on the rapid reaction and everything else and the other details, and those will upload those videos in due course so people can see them. Um, the I suspect that those ones were lost control. They lost control of them. But it was interesting that each of the penetrations of Polish and Romanian airspace has been by an unarmed platform. In amongst all the armed drones and stuff going over Ukraine at the time, it's odd that it was only specifically unarmed. What do they call them? Decoy drones that made it there. And given how many drones are active over the airspace, it'd be hard for NATO or Poland or anyone else to be looking at the mass wave of attacks and be able to pick out the half dozen that are continuing on and will penetrate your border in enough time to get an aircraft up to intercept. All right, so there's certain timelines involved and target identification and discrimination amongst existing air targets, which implies that, well, a couple of things. But the first one is that if it was a Russian launch thing, it implies that the Russians knew they'd lost control of them and had activated a side channel of communication with the Americans or maybe NATO and said, there's half dozen drones headed for Poland, they're decoy drones or whatever, they're unarmed, we no longer control them, they will enter your airspace at this time, giving them enough time to get the jets up to intercept. That's what I think the most likely outcome in cause is. The other one, and this comes back to, you again, look at the history of what's been going on. The last time something fell on Poland from the Ukrainian conflict was a missile. And whilst they blamed the Russians initially, it was a misfired missile from a Ukrainian site. Human error, more than likely. They probably put their bearing in, heading in 180 out, and instead of flying east, it flew west and then fell over Poland. But it was used as to whip Russian for a while before, and that's the reason why you don't see as much imagery coming out of missiles being dropped on Ukraine or bombs, etc. Because a lot of what had been coming up and where people were able to identify based on markings was that the origin for a lot of the ordnance was not what was being told to us. That they were coming, there was Ukraine mucking up their own attacks, or that it was a claim of like thermobaric warheads, but the markings were of a fairly, well, not benign, it still blows up, but markings of a general purpose bomb, etc. So Um, one of the suggestions is you can have standoff jets on station at all times. That's a goalie cap. Um, that is extraordinarily expensive and very, very difficult to maintain. And in fact, one of the concepts in warfare that is a mission kill, not a hard kill. A hard kill is blowing something up and killing the crew. A mission kill is denying the ability of an asset or a platform to carry out its mission. So, in the case of a submarine, a mission kill would be a navy able to keep the submarine under the water and away from whatever it was trying to do, be it intel or dropping off seals or whatever. Or a mission kill in terms of uh, the drone attacks over Ukraine would be all the decoys saturating air defense systems such that the Kinzels and the weapons carrying ones get through. You've you've killed the Patriots and everything else. You've denied their effectiveness by swarming them. And so it's a mission kill. You didn't blow them up, but you've prevented them from doing their mission. Having constant airborne patrols is a mission kill because aircraft, whilst they're designed to fly and things like that, you cannot sustain a 24/7 patrol like that without major issues. And so even at the coldest times of the Cold War, you had QRAs, QRFs, quick response aircrew, quick response forces. These were aircrew and air jets sitting at various bases in Germany and across Western Europe on like a 90-second. They had to be airborne within a minute, going flat chat, because to have the aircraft airborne constantly was causing them to lose aircraft because aircrew crash them. Like the more you fly it, the more likely it is you'll crash it. And it was also causing escalation with the Russians because they'd penetrate airspace by accident. It's the more time you're flying up and down someone's airspace border, the more chances that you're going to wander across by accident. And in fact, there's examples in um, from aircraft engaged in Western aircraft doing this, where they'd accidentally shot down in for real other Western aircraft because they were doing exercises. They pushed a button, interlocks didn't work, missile jumps off the rails, and it suddenly is for real. So it's a genuine mission kill. You can achieve nearly the same outcome by having a very well developed air defense radar system, which is designed to operate 24/7, and then respond with aircraft in an appropriate time frame. That time frame, though, there is a certain amount of lead time. You need time to get to it, which is why, given the penetration of Polish airspace and everything else, I believe that if it was a Russian system that was out of control, the Russians identified that and used side channel comms to give Poland and NATO enough time to get the jets there to intercept. The alternative, and this is sort of now heading down conspiracy theory territory, is that the Ukrainians had a supply, or they do have a supply, of crashed or otherwise forced down Russian drones that are serviceable, and that they could have then launched them into Poland and Romania to escalate things because public support for Ukraine is waning. And I've talked about that as well, that you see in the protest class, you see a falling off in public support for Ukraine. And so you've got this sudden rattling of sabers to get people focused on Ukraine again. So what better way to rattle the sabers and demand escalation and force NATO to come and do something than to fly something intentionally over their territory that you've captured and done? The idea of utilizing captured drones like that is not new. Just look at I don't think they've got a Global Hawk, but you look at the new North Korean strategic drone, it looks like a Global Hawk. You look at the drones the Iranians made post 2003. It was alleged that there were a number of American drones in Afghanistan that crashed in Iranian territory. Well, were they over Iran to begin with, but or were forced down. And so the Iranians were able to get a lot of tech for free, basically, Um, and so when they put some of their new drones on display, people went, hey, they look like the drones that went missing. So the idea that Ukraine has a supply of crashed or otherwise functional but um, not Russian anymore drones, not out of the ordinary, not unexpected. The fact that the drones that then penetrated airspace were unarmed, all of them were unarmed and were decoys or otherwise, is what makes it smell funny. Is what makes it seem like, well, if the Ukrainians were to do it to escalate the situation, doing it with an unarmed platform is enough to prompt a response from NATO, but not pose a direct threat to the Romanian or Polish people. And that's where okay, how do you disprove that? I mean, you get rid of a conspiracy by managing to disprove it. Unfortunately, like I said, last time something fell on Poland from the conflict, it was from Ukraine firing it and making a mistake. It wouldn't be given the propaganda in the media and stuff, I wouldn't put it past it being the case. Um, but particularly given the nature of the entire penetration. And I'm concerned either way, but that second option I find to be more scary than the first one because that is the actions of a side that feels like it is losing and is taking more and more risky actions in order to try and stay alive or to try and keep on its feet. And the other part of it too is when you read the articles about the interception, the attempted intercepts, they talk about how hard those drones were to keep on radar, and they lost visual and radar contact with them from time to time. So that then also comes back to the question of, well, how did they know they were coming in the first place? If it was nearly impossible to track them when they were inside the country, well, how reliable were they at much further distance? Like, how reliable was that contact? And again, how did you know that they were coming for you and not just that part of Ukraine? And so there's all those questions that are conveniently not being answered. And I know there was a German guy in the chat the other day talking about all the other things that are happening, these attacks on German power infrastructure and stuff like that. Well, they're actually they're anarchists, far left groups attacking the transmission towers and substations in Berlin because they don't want Tesla factories. So the not illusion, media was allowed to allude that what was happening to the power network in Berlin and Germany was a result of Russians or Russian aligned people. It was drones, it was this. Um, no, they were hardcore anarchists. So, anyway, step away from that for a bit. Ticketmaster. This article, now I don't know how I got to see this because it didn't pop up my normal chain. It's Technica. Yeah, I normally trust their stuff when I see it. This will be interesting because it just appeared a couple of days ago and hasn't filtered into the rest of the media just yet. Um, Live Nation and Ticketmaster getting into trouble for helping scalpers and jacking up prices and stuff. I mean, I know people have complained about the rort that Live Nation and Ticketmaster seem to have over tickets to live events and have been doing so for years. And then they've got these resale options to drive up prices and still take a cut and everything else. And people have alleged that they've turned a blind eye to scalpers and everything else, costing customers inflated prices and additional fees because, well, it's coming through a system owned by Ticketmaster. So the implication or the allegation is that Ticketmaster have provided genuine support to doing this and allowing them to collect more fees. I would like to see I mean, yep, they've just flouted laws and rules for ages. I mean, 2019 and before. Yeah, it'll be interesting to see. I hope that people pick up on this and other nations go after them as well, because it sucks trying to get live tickets to things and it's only going through Ticketmaster and you see the fees. It's like, just let me pay the fee directly to the performer. No, you can't do that. Ticketmaster must take their cut, and it's a massive cut. It's like, "Ugh." Well, weather. Well, it's sunny. We actually had a cold start. It was rainy on and off the last couple of days, and we're still getting the last couple of frosts. Like it's what, September. Yeah, we'll get the occasional frost into October. Um, this morning was frosty. My fingers were cold walking the dog. I get home and check the weather, thinking, oh, it's going to be nice and sunny today, like high teens. I think we're scheduled for the next few days. Only to find it was still -2 outside, and I'm like, huh, didn't expect that. So we're warming up, and in fact, speaking of weather, I will jump right ahead to environment infrastructure. We had Australia released a climate paper, climate call to action type thing, saying give the government more money because the climate is bad. Um, and then this article comes out. Australia has the best snow season in 3 years. Yeah. Well, given how wet the winter's been and how much moisture's been coming down over our small snowfields, yeah, not a surprise. Um, so again, bit of disconnect here. Of I know the climate is ending and it's always a heat wave, and look at our awesome snow season. Yeah. Um, far enough south. I had cold fingers this morning. Um, Southeast. I am in the southeast of Australia, and to the point, I will talk a lot about New South Wales, Victoria, and the ACT. A little bit about Queensland, but they're weird people up there. But no, my stomping ground was always southeast of Australia. I've moved around a bit, but I've lived enough places to know where the frosts are and stuff. I mean, you don't have to be necessarily high up to have frosts. Like I'm not on the snowfields, that's for sure, but I don't live that far away from them that my local weather isn't affected by them. Now, that could still be hundreds of miles. I've lived places where the terrain dominating the weather was a good 700 kilometers away, but it was a desert. And so even though where I lived was on the coast, well, city on the coast, our weather was driven by the desert. And so it was always dry and hot, and it was far drier and hotter than equivalent cities on the same latitude. So yeah, I live in the southeast of Australia on the like eastern seaboard. They say I'm not on the coast. No, no, no. I'm inland, but you can't necessarily live in that region and not be affected by, say, if you're east of the snowfields or northeast of the snowfields, a westerly wind coming through, a westerly change means you're going to cop icy, icy wind coming down off the snowfields, at least this time of year. Um, if you're west of the Great Dividing Range, you're not going to get so much the wind off the snowfields, but you will potentially you'll still get frosts and stuff like that if you've got you like your night skies. I mean, I forget the actual geographic terms for it, like continental, not rainfall, cloud formation type, and other bits and pieces. Gee, that fell out of my head years ago. But the point being that you're semi-arid actually, and so you just like in the desert when it gets super cold at night, out in those plains and stuff like that. If there's not a massive amount of cloud cover, you're going to get frosts, even in things. Well, not that far, not that sort of thing. I mean, we do have a microclimate, that's for sure. Uh, and it's only, uh, how far is it actually? It's noticeable across, wouldn't be more than 100 Ks. No, it's not even that. Maybe 50? Probably, I mean, I'd have to get a map out and measure it. But because of terrain shielding, so I live in a place that is terrain shielded, there's places nearby that are out on the plains and don't have um, ridges or lines of hills to protect them. So when we get weather events moving through, generally west to east, if there's thunderstorms and stuff predicted, generally they'll smash the places out on the plains because there's no hills or mountains or whatever to break up the weather. And so it's built up enough momentum, it'll just roll straight across them and hit them with hail and thunder and lightning and everything else. Whereas where I am, there's a line of hills, ridges, etc., that break up that weather. But it means that if it does get to us, it's generally pretty violent. And yeah, you can go, yeah, not maybe not block to block, but certainly 5Ks, less than that. It can be dry in one place, raining in the next, and that's passing showers more than anything else. I mean, I'd prefer it to be more substantive rain, but you also see the changes. I mean, I make no um, secret of the fact that I lived in the country, probably not a farm kid, but I was a country town kid growing up. And you see the effect of heat islands and things like that in the larger cities and stuff. So where a country town or out in the bush is getting rained on or getting a certain weather event, once it gets to the cities, it doesn't happen because the heat island changes the weather effect. Then if you get east of the Great Dividing Range, you tend to get coastal weather effects on the range, bit of a pick and mix really, and then you get your inland effects and stuff. So yeah, um, certainly in the southeast at the moment. I mean, I've seen places where I've been is actually relatively warm, and then I go look at the beach towns on roughly the same latitude, and they've got a freezing morning, and that's just microclimate more than anything else. So yeah, so speaking of snowfields, um, they're going to have, this is the last school holidays. Technically, it's the closure of the season. The October long weekend is traditionally the end of the season, June long weekend to October long weekend. Um, but 32 lifts open at Perisher is pretty good. I know people have been up there quite routinely, and they've been saying, yeah, there's been a fair bit of man-made snow to help, but it's been the best natural cover in ages. Well, that's the thing. 37 million people. We, as a nation, in fact, there's an article last week saying that it's like 27.5 million people in Australia. But I talked about that from the point of view of question is how much more can the environment sustain? Because all those people are going into places, unless they're going into high density accommodation, and generally there's not a lot of high density in and around Australian cities. People tend to be more spread out. Medium density is about as much as most people tolerate. The question then is, um, well, those houses go on farmland, and we don't have huge farmland. Uh, no. Is it the equinox? Maybe I should. um, maybe I should. Uh, I'll see how that goes down with the people I have to hang around. I'm taking the day off the equinox. Um, uh, no, that sort of stuff will get me doxxed rather quickly. Um, so yeah, the weather, it's going to be snow and it's going to be cooling down. Brisbane 25, well that's nice. Now Brisbane during summer, not a nice place to be. It's subtropical, but it acts like a tropical city. I prefer being in the tropics than being in Brisbane during summer. It's at least with the monsoon, you get that relief. Brisbane, you just get the humidity and the heat, and then you get these ridiculous storms that build up and break, and it's not even a proper monsoon. So, yeah, 25. There you go. Southern parts of New South Wales, cold and frosty morning before it becomes sunny during the day. But yeah, southerly winds, so off the snowfields. Yeah, cold. It's like on the weekend, beautiful sunny day, uh, nice and warm. But the moment the breeze picked up, it was like, oh, that's coming off the snowfields. So, 19. Adelaide, 18. Well, that's not too bad. 26 on Tuesday. So 26 on Tuesday means it's about a week for weather to cross from Perth. So middle of next week, between the two public holidays. Oh. So we have actually a funny things talking about days off. I do have an article I was going to talk about. Let me find it. Housing? No. Where did it go? Public holidays. In fact, there's two articles on it. So, depending on where you are in the country, you have two public holidays. So we have, well, it's Labor Day basically coming up. But funnily enough, Australian states will observe different public holidays and everything else. So the first one, October long weekend, is this weekend coming up, October 3. Hang on, next week. This week? Next week? Wait a second. No, the middle one. No, 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 no. Hang on, hang on, hang on, hang on, hang on. I got my dates. No, wait. These dates don't make sense. There is, um, we got long weekend. The long weekend in the middle of it's the school holidays are based around a couple of long weekends in October. The main one is Labor Day, and South Australia, New South Wales, and the ACT mark Labor Day on Monday, October the 6th. Queensland get one for the King's birthday. King's birthday in those other states is the one in June. Northern Territory, Tasmania, Victoria, and Western Australia don't get a public holiday. Victoria, because they have the grand final Friday as a public holiday, so that's September 26th ahead of the grand final, and the grand final's this Saturday if you're watching the AFL. There is another public holiday in a couple of other places. So the idea is, with a little bit of planning, a little bit of careful planning, you can get basically 9 days off for 4 days of leave. Because there's places that have October long weekend. Yep, same article, basically same article, same basically the same article. It is, yes. So I think there's a couple of places that have an extra public holiday as well. Ah, dear. Yeah, so the funny thing is, most of the public holidays are national. Now, I did go to a place, Melbourne Cup Day in Victoria, and I was living in Victoria at the time. So Melbourne Cup Day is a public holiday, and replaces uh, it replaces something. I know Canberra have Canberra Day. Adelaide has it's like Adelaide Day. It's something else. Like it's see Adelaide don't do South Australia don't do Boxing Day. They do Proclamation Day, which is conveniently happens to be December 26th, the date the state was proclaimed a state. Um, Canberra Day, I forget what that specific date aligns to. I think it's just like an extra one for the ACT. Full of public servants, so of course they're going to give themselves extra public holidays. But Victoria has always, not always, has had for many years Melbourne Cup Day, in part because most people just take the day off anyway. But I wasn't living in Melbourne, I was living in regional Victoria. And they had their they had a race course in that town, and so they had the town cup race meeting. And so the workplace I was at negotiated 2 half days instead of one full day. So we took half day Melbourne Cup and half day local race day cup. You're not far off there, Ash. You're not far off. So the comment in chat was that Canberra Day is when you sit at home and do nothing, as opposed to going to work and do nothing. Well, it's only limited to the ACT. So yes, all the public servants do that, and it's actually there's a whole bunch of because of the cross-border stuff. The ACT is not that big, and there's some settlements in New South Wales that are like hard up against the border, like Queanbeyan. Um, Plus, there's some sites. There's a military site. One of the big headquarters they put down there, they built in New South Wales, but everybody lives in the ACT because they have other military sites in the ACT, like headquartery type military sites. And so you have this couple of periods a year where, depending on which side of the border you live and which side of the border you work, will determine how you observe the public holidays. So I'm pretty sure for a while there it was where you worked, you observed the public holiday, and then uh, so things like MLK Day, um, yeah, there's I I think the US needs a sit down and looking at their public holidays and working them out. Things like MLK Junior Day makes sense. Yeah, makes sense. Uh, but yeah, I think they need to gazette the um, a proper list of national public holidays and why. And then you're going to have different states do their own thing for extra days and not. But I mean, the gazetting, that's how we found out when our public holidays were. So you'd each year about well, that if the state government would officially gazette the public holidays for the following year. And so you'd find out when things would be, and the same thing for school holidays and other bits and pieces. Um, Generally, we don't get too many public holidays in the back end of the year, so the second half. So this October period is the big one, and AFL Day and Melbourne Cup Day and everything else. Then Christmas. Uh, First half of the year tends to be cluttered. You've got Australia, well, apart from New Year's Day, you've got Australia Day. If you have a Canberra Day or an Adelaide Day or things like that, that's in the first half of the year. Easter, King's birthday slash, well, yeah, King's birthday, that's in June. Sometimes there's a few other bits and pieces as well. So yeah, it's well, it's like a Sunday shopping really. Very few of the and Anzac Day, April 25th. Although military members, that's a working day. Um, Day off for everyone else. What else was there in the first half of the year? Something else. Yeah, so you got a big gap where there's nothing over winter. In fact, there's a funny video online um, where a bunch of TV ad execs or ad people were asked to make an ad pushing for an extra holiday in the second half of the year. And so they've gone for this idea of, well, we have Anzac Day in the first half of the year. How about we have a day in the second half of the year celebrating another invasion? So let's invade New Zealand. And so they did this big ad, I mean, for the program, but it didn't go out for real. But it was hilarious. These National New Zealand Invasion Day, and the reasons why we should invade New Zealand. Um, it's just sitting there for the taking. and so that we get an extra. And the whole reason we're doing it is to have a public holiday. Well, there you go. I mean, it's important to give people staggered time off and things like that. It's certainly a vast improvement from, I guess, the Industrial Revolution and before that, when you had half days, Sundays, and things like that, or you had little more than the occasional, like yeah, Christmas and Easter, but that's about it. Um, your liturgical calendar drove the holidays during medieval period, but yeah, I mean, some nations do it better than others. Is that nobody goes to the mountains except on Mountain Day, or it's just a good excuse to have a day off? I think it's a good excuse to have a day off. But it's like what uh, uh, recognizing your natural wonders, I guess. Um, but yeah, well, the things that people do on their days off. This article came through, and I was, yeah, we talk a bit about social things as well. I was in two minds when I saw this. The initial reaction was, what a bad thing. Then I tried to justify, why would you do this? Like, why would you ban pill testing? And I couldn't, I couldn't come up with what I thought was a good enough argument to ban pill testing. You've got to have a certain pragmatic approach to things. People are going to smoke, drink, take drugs, engage in those sort of activities, irrespective of whether you ban them or not. The US experience with prohibition, for example. So, if members of your community are going to take illicit drugs and there is no TGA, Therapeutic Goods Administration oversight over the supply of illicit drugs, and therefore you don't know what you're getting from your street chemist, the idea of having pill testing to ensure or to act as a sort of attempted guarantee of safety of some people can go up to them and say, here, I bought this, what is it? I think it's meant to be blah, but it's something else, is, well, a good thing. I mean, they had them at music festivals and stuff for a while. I think the ACT has a program. I don't know if it's just a trial program or if it's for real. But to then have a state government come out and ban the testing of pills is okay. It's a zero tolerance approach, but it's ignoring the reality, which is that people will be taking it and that it doesn't have to be a massive system or massive setup, but there needs to be a way for people to maybe anonymously, whatever, but discreetly find out if what they've purchased in a baggie from somebody at the back of the pub is what they say it is, and you're not putting fentanyl up your nose in place of ketamine or something. I mean, they're both dangerous, but to make sure that whatever you're about to shove in your face or body is what you think it is and isn't going to have some sort of weird effect that you weren't going for. And there's been, I know I see occasionally the stuff coming out of Canberra about the ACT when they have their festivals and stuff like that. They occasionally publish reports about the testing that's undergone. Now, it's not getting massive numbers of chemicals being tested, but it's also interesting to see what's out in the streets and the quality of it and what is being cut with and what potentially is a risk. Well, uh, yes, 7-Elevens and KFC, big weird thing that Japan latched onto that. Uh, so 1.5 million for funding. Okay, fair enough. You need to run it, but it's surprising that non-profit sites were not getting enough public support, private support. So yes, it means that obviously some of the testing won't be there. It's some are using, obviously, once they find out what's in it, they're using less or avoiding the sample altogether. I mean, it's a public health thing, really. I don't get this as being. I don't see how that is viably argued for being good for public health, public safety. Well, okay. I've been so going back to the public holidays, looking at chat. I was in a Middle Eastern country a number of years ago during Ramadan, and they obviously had um, massive setup for that. But I left before Eid started, so I didn't get to see the celebration at the end. But certainly Ramadan was pretty big enough as it was. The thing that surprised me was because they were trying to cater to a Western audience as well, and given the time of year, I was astounded at the level of Christmas stuff and other stuff. Um, it's just, I was in, amazed that, well, I guess whatever makes the buck, really. Capitalism wins out. But it was funny to see these rather strict Islamic nations. Not that wouldn't be you wouldn't see it out of the malls, for example, but in the shopping centres, in the malls, oh yeah, any celebration was an excuse to put sales up. Oh, well, I'm sure there's someone out there for you, Ash. um, one of my other uh, semi-regulars now. She lives in Hong Kong, and I know she's had. She tells me from time to time about her experiences dating and um, the numbers that she gets or doesn't get. Well, okay. Well, being a romantic on purpose is fair enough. You put the spikes on the outside. Uh, but hey, people are just trying to make a connection, I guess, somewhat. If that's what makes you happy, then uh, who is to tell you otherwise? But yes, no, it is. But I mean, the point not just being Christmas stuff targeting Westerners, but it had a very Middle Eastern flavour to it. I mean, hell, Christianity arose out of the Middle East too, but it it felt um, Twilight Zone-ish. Like I recognised what I was looking at, but at the same time, it didn't make sense. No word for it. Well, I was thinking, well, hang on, what about hikikomori? But that's more of a shut-in than anything else. You're not a shut-in, are you? What's the other word I was trying to think of? Uh, yeah, I, I think societies kind of understand the shut-in type of person who doesn't deal with that sort of thing. Societies, all societies kind of struggle with people who are otherwise out in society and engaging with society, but have no desire. Well, see, that's the thing. It's like that's the only word I could think of, and it's like, but that's not the same thing. Um, I did, I do remember seeing a couple of articles, and I forget the term they used because they actually started talking about the female shut-ins, and well, they're still rare compared to the males, but there was a term they used there, and I can't remember what that was either. But I think most societies struggle with that idea of you're out there in society and engaging and everything else, but otherwise not forming that unique romantic bond with somebody at some point or seeking it and things like that. And that breaks people's brains to an extent. I mean, I did have an article lined up. I don't want to say that this is you by any stretch of the imagination, but it did come up about people having fewer friends. You should have lots of friends, Ash. But the point being, this is about cost of living and everything else, and the fact that it's getting that expensive to do things. People are avoiding the social interactions, the social networks that they used to have in order to um, get out and about. And so, cost of living is driving people away from those societal things. And so, it's there you go. Rising living costs, erosion of social networks is taking a toll on the well-being of people. Right. Okay. Well, that's the important thing. Is not to be prickly about it. Um, I'm sure at some point, if you are hoping otherwise, it'll take place. I mean, that sort of stuff that you're talking about there doesn't preclude those things from happening. I know plenty of people like that who have very happy relationships. Um, but yeah, finding the right person, if that's what you want to do. And if you don't, good for you. Well, like I said, it breaks society's brain that you're there, you're doing 95% of what people want or expect, and then you don't do that last 5%. And they're like, but what? And it's not people being pushy, some people are, but it's just people wanting to understand. And look, that's completely fine. History has got confirmed bachelors and bachelorettes. Nothing wrong with that. Nothing wrong with that. As long as it doesn't come at the cost of your social network. Um, COVID certainly didn't help very much. Social connections are weakening. Fewer friends, less frequent socializing, because it costs money that we don't have. So fewer friends, less socializing compared to 2001. Plus, the nature of communications and interactions with people post 2001. I mean, well, at least you could pretend the phone didn't ring back then. And so defined several times a week. I mean, plus no one goes out to the pub and club and stuff like that anymore. It's different. I mean, there is that societal change. It also depends on people coming through. Bodily pain. People in lower income houses are more likely to report experiencing pain. I don't understand how that ties into things, but that's Melbourne. Um, no, Sydney. Why did I think that was Melbourne? Definitely Sydney. Definitely Hyde Park. Uh, Speaking with the other day when I was talking about kids that were uh, commuting from Wollongong to Sydney, there's the school that they were commuting to, right in the city. And it was taking less time to get there from Wollongong than it was from the suburbs out this way, Bankstown and everything else. So inflation is, yep, increasing cost of living, wages. Okay, I don't think wages have kept pace with inflation. And I disagree with this statement about higher tax bracket reduces your real purchasing power. It's just the change. Okay, that's misunderstanding taxes, how the taxes work. You only pay in the bracket at that rate, and as you go up, yes, you pay more taxes, but you only pay the higher rate on the portion of your salary that is above that median line. You don't lose money as a result. So maybe people perceive that their salary's gone up and they're going to afford a higher standard of living without realizing that the net overall outcome is not as high as it was expected. So yeah, middle income earners spend more. Economic pressures shaping things. What a surprise. financial security, cost of raising a child, so people are cutting back on children because they can't afford it, um, or because uh, you're thinking of not being able to retire. There was a thing. Okay, I talked about increasing retirement age, and well, there's a couple of articles about it as well. Talking about people working into their 70s, uh, and how this idea of a retirement in your 60s has really only ever existed for a short period of history. And with the forward failing of the plans that people had, of, oh, this is how it's always going to work, it didn't work that way. And so, uh, yep, the Ponzi scheme of pension schemes never kept up. And plus, you had companies pillaging them, and it broke down. And then, yeah, the idea that the state would support you and other bits and pieces, yep, that went away. I mean, it might stop you from dying, won't be comfortable. And this one here about retirees living in rentals. This is, uh, I did have it. I do have it. Rental. No, there was an article I caught about uh, not loneliness, retirement, cost of living. There it was. I looked in the wrong direction. Um, Here we go. 1/4, and this again very interesting timings. 1/4 of retirees could stay renters. Now, um, for some people, they'll never move on to the ladder of property ownership, and then there's also issues about cost of servicing mortgages. People are expecting to die with a mortgage. The Even people trying to buy in, it's just, yeah, 1/4 of retirees being in rental accommodation. Well, I mean, that depends on how you can retire. Are people going to retire? So the the question is, I mean, they're picking on the fact that home building isn't keeping up with the population, and so that there's a shortfall of quite a lot of houses. And we've talked about these sort of issues. And so underbuilding means more pressure on available housing, greater number of multi-generational housing, which just normally wasn't a thing in Australian culture, but is probably going to be something more so, not just because of immigrant communities, but because people can't afford not to. And they're complaining about how things like first homeowners schemes is making housing affordability worse, that it's poor due to um, prices to wages. My pay didn't go up 200% in the last 20 years. House prices have risen more than 400% in the last 20 years. And that, yes, you're looking at least 10 years of saving to get a deposit. To what level? And that, yes, the numbers who owned outright have decreased from 3/4 to 2/3, which, uh, I mean, they still own a lot of the housing stock, but it's pointing out to people that looks like Adelaide. Kind of looks like Adelaide to me. Um, the Yeah, so reducing the number of outright ownership, increasing numbers with a mortgage. It's going to affect how people get into aged care, if they can at all, like aged care, residential aged care. It's going to affect their ability to fund home care packages, aged care in the home, that sort of thing. It's going to cause issues. And so um, the 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 ones in the very lowest bracket where you're looking at uh, rent-free or otherwise social housing, yeah, okay, they've stayed roughly the same. So the rest of the percentage of retirees are people renting. And so when you're on a retirement income, well, you may not be pulling down that much per week or fortnight per month. And out of that, you're going to have to service a rent. Now, I'm guessing you're going to have to decrease. And now there's some bigger concerns there with people in private rentals have no super, more than one quarter don't have any super, and that the super balance is relatively low. And half, basically half of what the homeowners have. And oh yeah, I mean $100,000 a year, that's $100,000 in super total is not much at retirement, seriously. But yeah, and the guys here saying, look, if you own your place, you can do it with 100 grand, but if you're renting, you're going to need at least three times that. So again, calling for extra assistance and extra help. But yeah, it's just showing that the things aren't keeping up. In fact, given that they're talking about less socializing and things like that and relationships, I suspect this is the same basic article that Channel 9 had. No, yes, Channel 9 had. So, all right. I mean, since we're on retirement, we might as well stay there for a sec. Is there something that I want to really hit before I finish up today? No, there's a whole bunch of stuff, but I spent a lot of time on the um, Estonian thing. Well, that certainly stuck it in. So I guess this come down to some of the other articles. Confidence in retirement. Again, people talking about whether or not we're going to be retiring in their 60s or now into their 70s. And yeah, there's a degree of forced superannuation contributions. You can always increase that contribution, but your minimum super contributions and stuff, not really going to get you much of a comfortable lifestyle at the moment. Um, I think we looked at this figure the other day. It's pretty similar to that. AMP, they're in a lot of superannuation stuff. So for them to come out and say this, I think it's fairly reasonable that, I mean, whatever they say in this regard is probably fairly safe to take. So 75,000 a year to retire, and I'm guessing that's to pull out of your super. Um, Females are going to be less secure in their retirement than males, probably because they've had a shorter working life and probably at a lower pay. And particularly if you're, I mean, not so much if you're individual. Um, Single females with children, yeah, you're not likely not to be in a high-paying role. So that means low super payments, low contributions. Um, sad reality. Sad reality. So yeah, there is a bit of a gender split, but I mean, well, how much can be done to fix it? The sandwich generation. That's an interesting term. Yeah, as people who do have children, as their children get older, I mean, there's article after article about how hard it is for the new adults to enter the workplace or enter the property market, and also there is just recently there an article about retirees having struggles, and so someone stuck in the middle are your slightly older workers with families and parents and having to support. I mean, there was an article, and we haven't got to it, about um, a bloke that basically had to quit his job to go care for a relative with dementia, and the impact that, well, dementia has on people is pretty poor. But yeah, that was covered off, and that there was a degree of contribution. In fact, this looks like the same figures. I dare say the other article was also taking from the AMP report. So shifts, older. Okay, costs of living. We've covered that sort of stuff. I talked about the eradication of the middle class the other day. We've got more of that coming up as well, where people are like, well, I can't afford essentials. I can't afford this. What do you mean I'm not middle class? Well, you're living almost below paycheck to paycheck. That's the reality. We talked about the public holidays, pill testing ban, housing. Well, I don't have the time to cover that today, but there it ties into this as well because the pressures on housing in general about the fact we don't have enough houses. There are people complaining about access to adequate housing, but at the same time, existing homeowners complaining about, no, we don't want these high-rise developments anywhere near us in our suburbs, and you can't have it both ways. At some point, either, well, house prices go up, but if people need a place to live and you can't spread out any further, you've got to densify. You've got to go to higher density housing. Otherwise, you can't fit people in. Plain and simple. Plain and simple. There was an article as well talking about the change in, I'll leave it on that graph, the change in rental policy in Byron Bay. So I talked about that as well previously about the coastal sea beachside, that's the Australian word for them, beachside towns where big money from the cities and, well, if they become exceedingly popular from celebrities and stuff, means that people are coming in and buying up the existing housing stock, driving the cost right up, whereas the existing income levels in this town were now priced out of the market. And so the houses are being bought up and either sitting vacant or being pushed onto short-term leases like Airbnb or other holiday leasing, which means that a local who could potentially lease the place is now shut out because it's being reserved for holiday leasing. And so it's basically causing locations where people can no longer afford to live and work at the same place. Places like that in the US and all over the world, really. But they'd ran a cap on, they tried to set a limit on the amount of time a property could be put on short-term leasing to 60 days now. I don't know if it's a quarter or a year or something, but it it's had an uncertain result after 12 months of testing. Either people are eating the cost and not worrying about it, or there needs to be some more refinement of the plan to again open up housing supply to the locals who are living and working there and supporting the infrastructure and the ambience that all the rich people and city people have decided they want and moved in and purchased everything up. Not the only beach town like that. In fact, I've made the comment to a few people visiting their beach towns and stuff that having stayed there for a little while and just observed the people moving around, a lot of these beach towns, we talk about um, class structure and stuff, shouldn't exist, etc. But these beach towns have two classes of people living in them. You're either really wealthy and therefore can afford to buy and pay the money demanded for beachfront living, or you have no money at all. Okay, maybe not no money at all, or you're living at or near the poverty line and a beach bum type thing. And then you got a scattering of people in between, professionals and retail workers and everything else. But your two largest groups of people living in the town or associated with the town are the wealthy, the property owners, the beachfront house owners, and the surfer bums living out the back of a van and surfing every day. both sets of people have a right to be there. But the problem is, being, of course, that first group has priced everybody else out, and that the leftover people in the middle, the professionals and retail workers and everything else, are far more likely to end up in the second grouping than the first grouping, because the incomes, the turnover just isn't there to provide the wealth to move people up. And yeah, it's somewhat sad to see, but they certainly aren't the beach towns I remember from when I was a kid. Then again, not much is the same as what I remember from when I was a kid. Uh, what else have we got? Yeah, okay, so yeah, articles talking about the lack of rate of building, the increase in multi-generational households because, well, people can't afford to live anywhere else. There was some stuff talking about, when I was talking about the snow season, on the environment. Uh, there were there was a bit of a pushback in Victoria about renewables, mainly wind farms going in on leasing or purchasing elements of farmland to build them, and the farmers were not happy at all because the turbines weren't being end of life properly. The benefits promised to them just weren't materialising, and therefore it wasn't cost effective, and it was damaging their productivity and everything else. And so the the community wasn't seeing the effective outcomes of having a renewable power system established in their community. And so, yeah, Victoria's going a bit back and forth on that at the moment. And the same goes for like talking about carbon emission trading schemes again under the environment paper release that came out the other day. And then tied to it is the idea that a suggestion that it's the emitters, so the power stations, the uh, refineries, etc., that should be paying the cost, not consumers. But the funny thing was the article basically said it should go to the government so that the government can help re- uh, remediate stuff for the consumer. But it's like, well, wait a second. All you're doing is saying that, hey, let's give the government another source of tax income. They'll do the right thing with it. I mean, they haven't done the right thing with any of the other tax income we've given them. This one will work though. And again, I've talked about the difficulties of renewables and how that they're not as that even with maturity and stuff, they can be hard to be as effective or as efficient as power plants of other sources and other types that may be a little bit more polluting. And so there was an article as well talking about the number of wind farms needed to be quadrupled, but none had been funded. Well, a bit hard to boost your renewables if you don't build them. So, but other than that, I think I think everyone's had enough of me ranting and raving for a few hours. So we'll call it there. Thank you very much to chat for joining in today. We'll close things out, put some tunes up. Deep breath. All right. So big thank you to everyone coming out. The next stream, I'm looking at maybe just going to a gaming stream tomorrow night, Pillars of Eternity. I was going to do another Just Chatting on Thursday, but it might be Friday at this rate. And I'm going to have to go and double check when I thought my public holidays were. Pretty sure people aren't going to like it if I just take random days off. Well, I will. The self-declared public holidays. I gazetted them. People should have paid attention. Yeah, so streaming tomorrow night, Pillars of Eternity. Then next Just Chatting is probably on Friday. Hopefully less ranting and raving and more coverage of the other stories I had lined up, which will probably be brand new stories by that point. Then, yep, the normal gaming schedule from there on out. I am publishing the clipped extracts of these streams. They're still about a week behind where I am right now, but I'm getting there. I just got to just make sure I've got the correct reference for each little subject that I'm doing. So make sure I'm referencing the source I'm using so that people can go and have a look for themselves and see whether I've. Oh, look, thank you, chat. That's what you're here for. I mean, to be honest, I did think as I was putting all these sources together this morning, I got like way too many sources, way too many to cover today. But that's the whole point of chat being here, and again, to challenge and draw out different discussions and what people are interested in. Hey, otherwise I'm just going to rabbit on about what I'm interested in. And that's the thing, because chat is global. What I'm experiencing and what I'm seeing is the Australian perspective. Well, a very unique Australian perspective on things. We're tucked away down here at the bottom of the world. I know, again, from having travelled and stuff like that, that our viewpoint and experience of things is not what a lot of other people get to see and do and experience. And I mean, hey, great for sharing ideas. Like when I go to a place that didn't speak English, I'd make a point to read their local English media, news and whatever else. And I'd know that what they put in the English paper was not what they put in their local language paper. Oh boy, definitely not. I mean, I couldn't read their language, but I knew enough by looking at it that they were different in content. But the important thing is it gives an insight into what the nation thinks, or is allowed to think, or is meant to think, or what is being sold to the Western thinker. And I mean, I still kept on top of the other news sources I normally followed as well, but it was interesting to see how it was done. Now, in the Middle East, for example, buying the local Gulf news or whatever, or listening just to Al Jazeera, you get obviously a very Arab-focused view on things. Or in the Gulf states, say the UAE, you get what the Emir wants you to think, or the family, the royal family has as their official line. And it's not so much a lace majest type situation. Very, very little criticism of the family, of the leaders, that's for sure. But it gave an alternate viewpoint. It's not a wrong viewpoint. It's a different viewpoint, and it's the viewpoint that when you sit down and think about why is it different to what I feel and what I think, are either of them wrong? Are either of them, could they be improved? It's just different people have different cultural influences, different reasons for thinking what they do and believing what they do. And I mean, people in those countries have different reasons to be afraid of their neighbours or not, and things like that. And it gives context and perspective, I guess, sometimes on what it is to live and come from other nations. I mean, certainly as an Australian, it made me feel that the idea of Australia as a lucky country, I got more context, I got more awareness of why that is. And so, yeah, I love having chat come up with things. And that's like we had a big chat the other day about how some Western Europeans are feeling about the whole Ukraine thing and everything else. And that they're only ever hearing one party line as such, and that all the various things that are going on are being blamed in one direction when some of the causes are independent groups and everything else. And it's refreshing to get that interaction and understanding. Plus it also means that, well, sometimes the viewpoints I'm putting forward coming from information that they may not see, or it may be information that they're like, yep, no, we'll never believe that. Same goes for other places. So again, Big thanks for everyone coming out today. Regulars, first timers, chatters, lurkers, everybody in between. People watching me on their days off, people not watching me on their days off, people watching me at work, listening to me at work, all that sort of stuff. I hope, if nothing else, people can come away with questions, if not answers, with questions and a desire to find out more about some of the things that are going on and to fact check me, please. But to go away and have a look and dig up this information and see for themselves that where this information comes from uh, and what it means, really. I want people to still be here next time, so look, I'll close it out. Again, big thank you to everyone. I shall not say good night because it's not good night, but everyone enjoy your day, evenings, nights, wherever you are in the world. We'll see you all again next stream.